Welcome to episode 1 of the Theo Jaffe podcast. Today I have the pleasure of speaking with Greg Fodor. Greg is a software engineer who's been involved in augmented and virtual reality for over a decade. He co-founded AltSpace VR, a virtual events company acquired by Microsoft, worked on Mozilla Hubs, a browser-based VR community platform, built Gel, a virtual environment video game for working, and is currently working on a new extended reality hardware stealth startup. On his Twitter account, @gfodor, he tweets about AI, VR and AR, unidentified aerial phenomena, aliens, and the philosophy of knowledge, all topics we discuss in this episode. This is the Theo Jaffe podcast. Thanks for listening, and now here's Greg Fodor. Hi, welcome to first ever episode of Theo Jaffe podcast. Today we have Greg Fodor.
That's right.
So, I guess we'll start off with today's big news, elephant in the room, which is room temperature ambient pressure superconductors. So do you think this whole thing is legit? And if so, what applications are you most excited about for it?
Well, I mean, I'm not somebody that knows too much about this stuff. So, I mean, I'm really just kind of like everybody else. It's in the public discourse, just trying to hope that this is a real thing. And I mean, certainly there will be some amazing breakthroughs if this is the case. But yeah, I don't really have too much. I don't really have too many thoughts on this. It's just kind of like everybody else, hoping that it gets replicated quickly so we can get clarity on if it's the case.
Yeah, I mean, it would be pretty great. I saw a tweet today about what if we had handheld railguns that used superconductors instead of using gunpowder for projectiles. So that might be kind of cool.
Yeah, I mean, I think like this is one of those things where everyone's kind of like hopes that this would happen at some point. It's like anything else with like new knowledge like this. You can't really know a priori like whether or not it's going to happen tomorrow or a month from now or 10 years from now or never. So there's reasons for people to be skeptical of such things since, you couldn't really know beforehand when it was going to happen. But, when these things do happen, then they happened, and now you've got like pure inductive learning from there. I mean, certainly if this is the case that these folks have made this breakthrough, I think what you would expect is, you'd see a variety of follow-on inductive kind of hill climbing going on all fronts around that, not just on the application side, but also, the mechanism of how it works, like understanding maybe some deeper causes that maybe we didn't even know about because we didn't really have the tools we needed to have a replicated environment for such things. So it's really easy. It's really easy to understate something like this if it turns out to be true, because it does feel to me, at least as a layman, of that kind of like breakthrough. If it did occur, that'll unlock many doors. But we'll see what happens.
Yeah, I mean, it is kind of interesting that they had this decades-defining, Nobel Prize-deserving scientific discovery, and they kind of just threw it up on Archive. Like, here you go. No fanfare, no gigantic announcement, just this is it. I mean, it's kind of cool watching science happen in real time, assuming that it's real, of course. Which
Sure. I mean, replication also sounds like for this would be relatively easy, right? I mean, again, like I don't really know much about this, but it seems like up front, like it could have turned out that if this, assuming again that this is true, that it could have turned out that you would need some like really esoteric or highly costly setup to be able to replicate this result. But the universe may have gifted us another gift on top of the gift, which is that perhaps it's also quite easy to replicate and maybe manufacture even.
Yeah, so that's the elephant in the room for today. The elephant in the room for the last year, or at least the last 8 months or so, has been AI. So you've been very interested in AI on Twitter. What are your personal AGI timelines?
Well, I mean, I think I kind of feel that we'll pass the Kurzweil style Turing test probably within 3 to 4 years. That's just my personal, belief based upon what I kind of imagine might be happening with neural networks, kind of where they'll top out. And that test, according to him, is basically you impanel a large number of humans from diverse backgrounds, various levels of expertise, various people that may not have a specific domain expertise, and they have the ability to kind of have an unbounded sustained challenge against the AI in the classic Turing test. But basically it's parallel happening with many people, and ultimately you're looking for a resolution where they all kind of flip in a way that they can't tell the difference between the AI and the humans. So I think that will probably happen. I think that the small margin there, really is going to boil down to of whether or not neural networks have this capacity for what David Deutsch calls like the ability to generate new good explanations, right? And I think it's a little bit fuzzy to me if the Kurzweil-Turing test will really tease that capacity out or not. Like the Kurzweil-Turing test certainly might pass, even if neural networks cannot do that. And kind of my prediction is constrained on the idea that the network could pass even if it lacks that capacity. So specifically what that means is the neural network being able to kind of create new risky conjectures that aren't really inductive out of its training set, right? And so I think it seems possible that the Kurzweil-Turing test would pass, even if it couldn't do that per se, because it can kind of generate a lot of stuff that is going to be close enough to that from the perspective of a human judge that most likely it would pass in a competitive environment versus humans, because it's actually really hard to get a human to do that kind of thing in a conceivably like repeatable way. So I think that's kind of like where we end up with that question. Now, I don't know if you would really consider that AGI. That's kind of a separate question, but I think once you're at that point, you really are in a regime where unless you're physically with a person, unless you're like kind of asserting their physical presence of some kind, that you now really do have a situation where you don't really know if you're dealing with a person or an AI, if you're interacting with them through any kind of mediated communication tool through the internet or anything like that. So that'll be a pretty insane space shift. I mean, I think it's already kind of happening in the small to a certain degree. You're arguing with bots on Twitter and so on, and perhaps they are AIs. I feel like I might have been fooled a few times already by these LLMs into arguing with someone that actually turns out to just be some neural network. But I think once that Turing test passes, that specific kind, you've really kind of now crossed the frontier where it's the case for every person, for every interaction of most daily life is one where if you're not physically asserting the person's biological presence with you, that you really have no way to develop a prior on if they're a person or not a person, or a human or not a human. So that's kind of where I think that's going to fall down in about 3 or 4 years.
So by Kurzweil-Turing test, do you mean a group of laymen who are asking the AI or just having a normal conversation with it? Or do you mean like adversarial prompt engineering experts who know all the flaws in the AI systems and who will try to exploit them?
I mean, my understanding is this is basically the classic Turing test, but kind of expanded to include a large body of humans of all backgrounds, kind of selected for a broad swath of the kinds of things you'd want to kind of adversarially test the AI against through a natural language process. So it will certainly need to include experts of various kind of scientific, intellectual domains, but you really would want it to include many people from all different backgrounds that might be able to carve out some kind of basic fundamental capacity of the AI that others might miss. Everything from just the way it feels to talk to it, from the way the responses communicate to you that it's actually understanding what you're saying. People are of all different backgrounds would have to come in to try to sum over a set of things that we think would basically reduce the margin down to the point where we ought to expect if you added one more person to that test, they would 100% still fall into the category of not being able to classify it as an AI or a human. I think that's like, there's probably some if I had to guess, this is really rough speculative, but like on the order of like 1,000 people or something, there's going to be some population where if you can get the right population, get a large enough number of people, that you ought to like expect to just eventually converge on a situation where adding more people to that is not going to change the outcome anymore. It's going to just basically be like, okay, yeah, we can't tell the difference anymore. And whenever that threshold is reached, you've kind of by definition made it so that that's true for all people, right?
So this Turing test is about natural language. When do you think we might pass a Turing test with imagery? So like you say, generate an image of someone holding their hands up in the air like this, 2 hands out, palms open, facing the camera, and it will just do it and know what you're talking about and not mess up the hands and get the details in the background right. That would take some probably some better world modeling than current language models have, or current diffusion models have now.
I think it's a tricky question because I don't actually know. I mean, really, at the end of the day, I think what you're talking about here is an avatar embodiment style of interaction with an AI, right? And so, to actually convey an avatar-based AI versus one that simply is talking to you through a text box, I'm actually not fully convinced that that's actually a huge gap. I think if you have a thing that can spit out text, basically instantaneously that passes the Kurzweil-Turing test, to get it from there to something that feels like you're interacting with a person via some kind of avatar embodiment, I think is a very small step, and maybe not even one that requires AI neural networks per se to even do at that point, especially 3 or 4 years from now. Ultimately, what you would need to be able to be doing is when you're interacting with an avatar, right? There's a couple things that you need to get right. You need to get the nonverbal communication right, which is basically their body language, whether or not they're like looking at you the right way, their eye motion, their hand and arm motion, and that kind of thing. The thing about these kinds of social cueing is that sometimes it's like really, really sensitive. Like if you do it wrong, people notice very quickly. Like if somebody looks at you and it's like they're talking to you and they're not making eye contact with you like at all, then like you kind of like get a totally different sense that they're really not a human, right? But there's a very large area where like you have a lot of leniency in terms of how well you have to get it. You really just need to convince the person on the receiving side that like that it's not that's the sender is not like lying about their social cues, right? So I think that kind of thing is already pretty close. I mean, you certainly should be able to string together some various mocap things. And, you can, if you have a neural network that can stream text and basically answer things in a way that passes the Kurzweil-Turing test, you certainly can wire that up to one that would effectively, stream commands to an avatar puppeting system that would leverage a variety of hooks for it to be able to express what kind of body language it wanted to convey moment by moment. And then you can just drive that using traditional algorithms. And so I think really, and the other thing with avatars is that there's actually a lot of ability for you to dial this down. So if you just have like a sphere with two eyes and a mouth that's like doing like lip syncing off of the audio stream, you really can get a sense of social presence through that. That's surprising. So that will be another degree of freedom to kind of reduce the need for these Kurzweil passing neural networks to be able to communicate with you in a way that feels natural, like as if they're embodied as a person in front of you. So I think all of that's going to fall, honestly, the technology will probably be in place before the Kurzweil test pass, if I had to guess. You'll already have avatars interacting with you that aren't, Turing passing neural networks. So you'll know that they're robots by what they say, but not by how they appear, right? They'll basically like be failing for the reasons of what they say. So the last frontier will be like when they start to say things that you just can't tell anymore, that they're not real. So, or I shouldn't say not real, they're not human, right? So I think that's kind of the order of operations. Now, of course, like it could be wrong about the order, could be wrong about how hard that is, but I kind of generally think that the Turing test passing is the hardest of the problems.
So when we do pass the Turing test, how long is it? Just a straight linear path from an AI that can reliably sound like a human and pass some tests to the kind of like world altering transformative AI that automates decades of scientific discovery? Or will that take something entirely different? Because David Deutsch seems to take the view that it would require something totally different.
Well, I mean, I think there's a lot of elements to that, right? So, I mean, trying to guess things that are like a few foundational breakthroughs ahead is really, really hard to do. Trying to guess things that are one foundational breakthrough is also really hard to do. The question is these kinds of like basic agentic AIs going to be like requiring any kind of new foundational transformative understanding of how things work in our minds or things like this. Now, where I fall on that right now is that I don't think that it really is going to require that for us to unlock significantly capable agents out of the existing architectures and existing paradigm of neural networks, right? So now this is just like an intuition thing, but I really do think there's enough smart people focused on this right now, and there's enough demand and there's enough incentives to figure it out that you'll see some kind of like, I mean, somebody just posted something that I think probably is maybe getting closer, where you're gonna, you can't know for sure, but I do think you'll see something that feels closer to a working agent that can do reasonably cool things with an API access to the internet, like relatively soon. I mean, within a year or something, people will start to pay more attention to this stuff as it works. And
Well,
so I don't think any of this requires it forming risky conjectures. I don't think it requires it trying to come up with explanations for things it doesn't understand, that it can't fish out of its training set. I think this is really just about being able to grok what facilities are available to it to, achieve its dictated goals, and then constructing a plan to basically execute, and validate each step and not mess it up along the way. And then, where you end up with that is that you've got this little agent that can start to do very, very basic things by interacting with the internet, but from an actions perspective instead of like a generation perspective.
yeah. So what was the project that you saw that you think is closer to a working agent? Because so far the agents that we've seen have not been very good at all.
I don't know if it actually was an agent now that I'm thinking about it. Uh, I can share it with you after, but I think somebody was just posting something they did with some code generation stuff. So I mean, obviously, code generation is somewhat adjacent to agents, because if you can generate code, maybe you actually can generate like atomic actions and so on that you can execute. So maybe it's like a kind of attached on problem. But anyway, I mean, I think in general, like way I think about it is, I mean, I wrote this long essay about this, and so I really genuinely think AI risk due to agents is a significant near-term risk. Like, there's a lot of people talking about, super intelligence risk, like, all these rationalist theories around goals and convergence around, all these various outcomes. And I just really think that a lot of this, I mean, it may be correct, it may not be correct, right? I can argue either way, depending on like what assumptions you bake into it. But the biggest thing that I feel that's true, that I feel like not enough people are talking about, is most of this stuff is motivating like really kind of like two key things, right? It's motivating, do we need to solve the alignment problem quickly or at all, I guess, but quickly being a more kind of relevant question. And then the second is like, do we need to slow down AI development somehow, like through regulation or things like this? And so when I look at those two questions, right, like, okay, most of the discourse around whether or not those things are the case is revolving around conjectures and thinking about the nature of superintelligence, like whether or not we're going to pass the Turing test, maybe to some degree, or agents are going to become, certain levels of completely like superhuman or whatever. I really don't think you need to have any of that to motivate the answers to those two questions, right? So I think on the question of the alignment problem, um, you really have to just dial in and ask, like, what's the most near term situation where you have at least not necessarily an existential situation where humanity could get wiped out, which people seem to love to talk about, but like at the end of the day, that's like the end of the book. Like, but I think there are definitely situations where you have something akin to like a global scale crisis, or even a like country size crisis, where this is the kind of thing where like during the pandemic, it's like affecting everybody. It's like adding a like drag on society. It's like really, really slowing things down and making the world less safe for everybody, right? So I think those kinds of scenarios, I think, can be kind of conjured up basically based on some very, very minimal assumptions about the nature of like the evolution of agent-based AI systems over the next couple of years. And so I think if you kind of put all that together, what you end up with is you say, okay, we definitely need to solve the alignment problem, and we need to solve it a lot sooner than we thought, because we need to actually solve it before something like a kind of COVID pandemic style crisis occurs. Like, I mean, obviously the species would survive such a thing in this analogy, but like, we really should not want that to happen, right? Like, it would be really phenomenal if we at least had some kind of like breakthrough that would ensure such a thing would be not possible. Now, the alignment problem in general is kind of a dicey thing to talk about. It's like not really well defined, and that all is a problem unto itself. But at the end of the day, like the question about agents is really going to be about like, could agents plunge us into some kind of like pandemic level crisis? I think the answer is absolutely yes, and I think absolutely probably within a few years I could see that happening. And so that alone motivates just the kind of first order approximation of the alignment problem, which is like, basically, can you get an AI to refuse an order? Can you get an AI to just, not do things that will, a priori be reasonably understood to lead to such a crisis in the minds of most, if not all humans, other than the person commanding it to do so, right? So I think that motivates the alignment problem kind of on its own without having to argue about like super intelligence and like, the orthogonality thesis and all these things. I think you can just basically get there and get to an agreement that like we need to solve this problem like very quickly because of this risk from agents. Then the second pillar of a lot of the discourse is like, okay, how do we regulate AI? How do we need to slow down and all of this stuff? And I think this is obviously a very complicated topic, but the way I come down on that is that you really have like there's a few assumptions you have to basically start with, right? So the first question is like, can you actually put a global pause on this trend, right? Can you actually get to a point where you're meaningfully slowing down all actors, right? And in this case, all actors would be like all of the US AI companies, all the governments of the world who basically, as they one by one flip on the idea that this technology can lead to an outsized amount of sovereign power, are going to continue to pursue it. Like, can you actually pause all the actors? And my answer to that is no. I don't think that you can pause all the kind of relevant actors in this. You really only need to say that you can't pause all of them. It's like if a single actor basically or continue to make progress at a large scale advantage to the others, all of your a lot of your solution space quickly evaporates, because now if we're talking about trying to regulate it to minimize existential risk, your single actor just now is kind of the frontier and is basically going to get there way before everybody else.
So you're saying it's a Malachian coordination problem.
What do you mean?
Have you heard of Scott Alexander's Meditations on Moloch?
I think, yeah, that makes sense to me. Yeah, I mean, it's certainly like one of these situations where you're kind of like, I think you're kind of putting all of your eggs in one kind of basket, in the sense that you're like, okay, we assume we have such a killer pause mechanism that we have a silver bullet that's going to basically pause all the actors, even though all the actors have counter incentives to keep going in their own way. So I think that's like one big hole, right? And so the other big hole, so that one I think has been pointed out by a lot of people, and I think it's completely correct. But I think the other big hole that I think I noticed, and I think I'm not the only one. I think OpenAI noticed it too, honestly. But like the other big hole is that we're in this like really strange situation. Okay, so basically, if you assume that the alignment problem needs to be solved quickly, okay, like I was kind of motivating it through agents, and if you assume that it requires new foundational knowledge to basically solve it, like not just like incremental knowledge, but like we need to actually understand something fundamental about the universe if we want to have a hope of solving it in any durable way. Well, now you're in a situation where you really are like gated on like fundamental research, like you're gated on like the capacity for humans to rapidly come up with, test, and like validate very, very unconventional hypotheses, right? And so the strange situation we find ourselves in, though, specifically now, is that the entire conversation about this is happening around a technology that is fundamentally an accelerant for that very same process. Okay, so let me just like say that like more directly. Like, if we need to create new knowledge, new foundational knowledge quickly through fundamental research to protect ourselves from AI risk, right? Like through solving the alignment problem, we actually need to ensure that we have the best tools to create new knowledge, okay? And it just so happens that it turns out, it looks to be the case that one of the best, if not the best tools to create new knowledge quickly is the very same technology that we're trying to de-risk. So it's this very strange circular reference, in that if we don't have state-of-the-art artificial intelligence in hand, we may be in a situation where we will never solve the alignment problem absent having a certain level of AI technology in hand to do it, right?
Yeah,
So, right.
that's a fundamental problem with MIRI, with what Eliezer Yudkowsky tried to do back 20 years ago before there was anything resembling functional general AI, where he tried to solve the alignment problem using abstract logic and decision theory. And by the way, earlier we were talking about how neural networks might not be able to conjecture and create new explanations in the Deutschian sense. So how do you square that with neural networks being able to create new foundational knowledge to solve the alignment problem? Is it that they can take care of everything else and leave alignment researchers to create the foundational knowledge?
Yes, yes. So the idea would be that the neural networks wouldn't necessarily be doing that whatever it is that allows humans to do this, assuming they can't, which like is still an open question, but like assuming they can't. Um, but the net idea is that like if you have a bunch of humans with a set of tools, they can produce knowledge at some rate. And then if you add artificial intelligence technologies, pre-AGI AI technologies, for example, um, depending on how capable those technologies are, you get some multiplier out of their ability to do that, because the AI can effectively help them think through things better. It can help them do research better. It can help them construct experimental structures. Anything that's inductive in the chain, the AI of a certain like caliber will be able to rapidly accelerate the process of creating new knowledge. It just means, though, that perhaps the neural networks couldn't do the entire thing by themselves, but it's obviously that going to be some kind of multiplier effect on our ability to generate that kind of knowledge. And so I think that's really kind of the weird situation we're in, where you could really imagine a scenario where let's say where we are right now is like generation alpha for where we are with just neural networks in general, and let's call like where we are a year from now generation beta, and then gamma, delta, gamma, whatever. Like it could turn out that the alignment problem only yields once we get to it, like say gamma, right? Now, like let's say we hit the brakes at beta, okay? What that means is like we have a situation where all of the good actors, per se, the ones that would have pursued the alignment problem with gamma, now are boxed out, okay? And they're permanently boxed out. They are never going to solve the alignment problem until they're handed generation gamma, okay? Meanwhile, assuming you weren't able to stop all other actors, you've basically now guaranteed death, right? Like you've basically now guaranteed, like, this is obviously conditional on a lot of assumptions here, so like it could be completely wrong, but like if it turns out that AI technology above a certain level of capability is a necessary precondition to solving the alignment problem, then pausing AI itself in this way, that's only a partial pause on actors, would actually be the determining effect that kills everybody, which is insane. But it's actually the case that under that regime, that would be the case, because if we had not paused, we could have gotten to gamma, we could have handed it to the good actors, and they could have solved alignment before it was too late. So that like really kind of strange regime is the one that I'm very fearful of, because it does seem to me that it's highly likely that we need foundational knowledge to solve alignment. It's highly likely to me that we need to solve alignment quickly because of the risk of agentic AI, not because we basically need to just front run how a super intelligence is going to work. Eliezer and everybody might be right about how that's going to end up, right? Maybe it turns out they're all right, but it doesn't actually matter in terms of motivating the alignment problem. So if it turns out that we try to do this kind of crazy regime where we're pausing half of the actors and not the other half, and then it turns out the other half are like rogue actors or don't buy into the problem or aren't interested in aligning AI, then like that move is actually the determining move of the whole game, and we just lost.
Yeah.
So like,
So just in case anybody watching is interested, Fodor wrote a great article called "To De-risk AI, the Government Must Accelerate Knowledge Production," which pretty much talks about exactly what he's been talking about for the last few minutes. Essentially, it's this plus policy recommendations to create some kind of almost like a decentralized Manhattan Project to solve alignment. And yeah, I think it's a great article. I quote tweeted it. I agree with it pretty much entirely. Since the article came out, OpenAI has announced their super alignment initiative. And just today, actually, OpenAI, Anthropic, Google, and Microsoft announced a new frontier model forum to coordinate work on their most capable models. So how does that affect your picture? Do you think they're kind of implementing the plan you suggested?
I mean, I'd have to look at that. I mean, the big tell of like if somebody is implementing what I'm writing about in there is basically like a lot of people have tried to, frame research institutions around this and so on. And I think there are some people who have proposed, giving these institutions access to AI technology, obviously for the purpose of like working on it to try to align it, right? Like as a kind of way, if you were a lab and you were working on like animal research, you would need animals to like experiment on, right? I think that's like kind of like the mental model a lot of people have of what this is. But I think like the tell that they're thinking about it, at least in the same way I'm thinking about it, is you're not giving them the AI per se as the like test subjects, although that is the case that it would be in a certain sense the test subjects, but you're also kind of simultaneously giving them the AI as an essential like component of how they work, and it's an accelerant for them to succeed. This is like the strange thing we're in, where like if you're, I mean, I don't want to make up an analogy on the spot that sucks, but basically like if you're doing like some kind of animal testing, like, and you need to use like the animals themselves to do the testing, and you need to test on the animals at the same time, like, that's kind of the situation we're in. And it's not really that obvious, I think, like if your framing is on like what AI actually is capable of being able to do for people, especially if it continues to accelerate the way it looks like it is, like you really need the initial conditions to be set up so that these people across the entire earth are basically the most over leveraged on using AI itself at the very closest to the frontier you can get them. So that's like why you need, like the way I structured it in my argument is like you need this group of people to basically have carte blanche to go to the government and say, we need inference cycles on this cluster at Google. We need to be able to access like GPT 4.5 training run from April or whatever. Like they need to be able to have the government do the blocking and tackling if it's necessary. Hopefully the government's like never involved, but like you need them to basically be at the frontier, not because they need the animals to test on it, but because they need to actually ride the animals to get to the end of the finish line, right? They actually need that stuff to basically ensure that they win before some like rogue actor basically like accidentally like unleashes like some hellscape for all of us to live through. You
Yeah.
need them basically leveraging the best technology that we have across all of the actors. Maybe one day Google's a little bit ahead, maybe one day OpenAI is ever ahead. Maybe one day John Carmack's startup like is secretly ahead of everybody else. The point is, though, that these researchers need to be at the very frontier of everybody, and that's the essential component. So,
Yeah, I think that the world is kind of shaping to be as you described, where you have lots of frontier alignment researchers who have access to all the super frontier models. I mean, it does look like Anthropic, OpenAI, and Google and the others are going to be sharing their top findings with each other. I think in this case, they may care more about the survival of humanity than they do about their own short-term competitive advantages. But we'll see. We'll see. So when it comes to the alignment problem itself, like what do you picture when you think of the alignment problem? Because lots of people, some people picture it, some people being Gudkowski picture it as like a abstract decision theory, mathematical proof that comes from formalizing human values. Some people like Jan LeCun picture it as basically just reliability engineering, like you engineer a rocket to not blow up. Other people still like have entirely different views on it because the alignment problem means alignment with human values, and then there's a question of whose human values, and then
yeah.
it kind of falls apart from there.
Well, I mean, I think the problem is obviously underdefined in a general sense. Okay, so I think the only way I've really been able to think about it is to start from like the kind of most extreme cases where you really, ultimately from what I can tell, it really does boil down to a situation where there's got to be some surface area of like, genie wishes that people are going to be able to make of these things that just simply cannot be like manifested. And like you can kind of start from the things that everybody kind of agrees upon ought not to be manifested. and now like work backwards from there, just to motivate the idea that the problem is coherent. Okay,
So
like
invert the problem.
what's that?
So invert the problem, basically.
Well, I'm just talking about like motivating the problem that is actually like that it's actually real. Okay, because I think there's a big segment of people that like think this whole thing is just like a bunch of nonsense. There's no, because when people say, "Oh, who's human values," right? What that usually feels like to me is a way to kind of dismiss the problem in general, right? It's basically say, "Okay, well, the problem is incoherent, so therefore we there is no problem." Okay, this is like I think a bad way to think about it. I think the way to think about it is like, okay, there absolutely has to be some subset of things that we all agree. Like you ask any human on Earth, like if an arbitrary human decided they had a death wish for the species and they like knew a priori if they typed in this command that it would kill everybody, that we ought to all agree that like all AI systems should like not be able to do that, right? So, really at the end of the day, though, if you like zoom out, what does that really boil down to? Okay, there's really only two possibilities. The first is that like there's either like you preempt or you postempt. Like it's like either you set things up so no human ever makes such a request, okay? And I'm like, never, I'm actually not going to rule that out because this is the kind of thing that you really can't rule anything out. You like set things up so no human would make such a request, or you set things up so that after that request is made, it's never manifested, right? It's never actually executed on. It's never actually possible to run. Now, both of those seem impossible to solve, right? Which is why I basically think of this fundamentally as about finding new foundational knowledge. Like it's not that I say I know they can be solved. It's not that I say like I know what the knowledge is that will solve it. It's just the fact that they both seem to be impossible as solves tells me that there's some foundational knowledge that at a minimum we need to find if we intend to solve it. Now, like certainly it's really good to have these like intermediate measures where say like you rely on centralizing forces such that their models are baked in and that everything that goes over the fence is somehow irreversibly like lobotomized so that you can't do certain things. That also has obviously its own set of problems. It's not a solve, it's not anything. It's basically just like a little bit of a friction force that like slows some of this risk down. But really at the end of the day, I think it does boil down to this fundamentally seemingly impossible problem, which is why I immediately go to the idea that like if we cut through all the nonsense, we need to develop some kind of like foundational research program. And a good foundational research program comes in with basically no assumptions about what the solution space is. Like, one of my biggest problems with like, I mean, I think it's great that Miri was working on this for so long. I mean, I remember like years and years ago reading about like, I've read like Superintelligence book and like all the thinking around the game theoretical foundations for like why we should expect certain things. I think that's all really good that it was done. But the problem is that by front loading your solution space to be like a very specific set of potential solutions, if it turns out you're wrong, like now you just wasted like a decade on something and
2 decades.
yeah, 2 decades, right? So I think at the end of the day, like if there is going to be this kind of research program, a huge unforced error would be to smuggle in some kind of assumptions. Even if we don't do it on purpose, you have to kind of like actively hedge yourself and like avoid baking in assumptions because we are talking about something that seems to be impossible, right? Like one analogy I make is like if you go back before we understood electromagnetism, like if you ask somebody like, okay, I want to be able to talk to a person on the other side of the country like instantly. Like I want to say a word and I want them to hear it in their ear. Okay, like that would sound like impossible, right? Like that would sound like insane. I mean, it's even insane when you say it out loud. It sounds crazy that we can do that, right? And so,
Like
and so
right
that's
now.
the right, and that's the situation we're in with the alignment problem. It's the kind of thing that like if you just sit down and you frame it at the very base case, like no human should ever be able to admit a command that we all know a priori would kill everybody, and the AI could even understand a priori would kill everybody. Like we need to solve it so that that command doesn't get executed or never gets requested across all humans, across all AIs. That seems impossible to solve. Okay, the
Well,
same. Sorry, go ahead.
yeah, Rune tweeted recently that he said something like along the lines of, it's obvious that we live in an alignment by default universe, but nobody wants to talk about it. And of course, it's hard to know what Rune is thinking, really. It's hard to know what OpenAI is thinking, really. This Twitter account is like the tiniest, blurriest window into whatever is going on inside that place. but it seems to be that there's a decent chance that just kind of RLHFing and bootstrapping a model will effectively solve the alignment problem, which of course could be very wrong.
I think alignment by default is a little bit of a limited thing. I think there's a very, very good chance that we're in a universe where unalignment is very, very unlikely. Okay, I think that's certainly possible, and it would be somewhat coherent with like a lot of the UFO stuff, which we could talk about. But like, I think at the end of the day, the alignment problem must be solved, especially if we're going to just get to a case that we can all agree on. There's got to be at least one case that we could all agree on, like, and as soon as you have one case, that motivates the problem, right? So you have a situation where the base case is motivated, the problem is motivated, it must be solved. Yeah, maybe it just converges onto a solve by itself, okay? But if it doesn't converge by itself, it looks to me like the kind of thing that we need new foundational knowledge to solve. Like if physical reality just like naturally converges on a solve, that's excellent. But like at the end of the day, like that's inert. Like we can't do anything with that. Like we can just kind of sit in the box and pray. But like, you know, if you're going to talk about actionability, like you have to actually start with like a kind of grounding assumption about like what it will take to solve it. And to me, if I think about it and I sit down, I'm like, what it's going to take to solve it is, you know, in terms of delta on what we can do versus what we didn't do counterfactually, we need to find the best optimal system to accelerate generation of any foundational knowledge that could possibly lead to a solution. And so, you know, the only way I know that that happens is by like investing human and capital into a research institution. And in this particular case, by ensuring that we don't make the unforced error of like not giving them the state-of-the-art AI systems to accelerate them. That's kind of where I fell down on it. And it, you know, I don't, particularly like the argument around the risk of regulation. Like, I really don't know how to like, I would love to like just sit and like, you know, talk to Eliza or whoever. Like, I just want to understand like why that's wrong. Like, because I really don't understand why it's wrong. Like,
yeah, hopefully I'll interview him soon.
I mean, like, you know, you have to start and say, okay, is there any regulatory, because it's not about just like slowing things down, okay? There's two conjoined assumptions. Again, like you either, if you can't slow down every act, if you can't stop every actor, okay? And if it turns like, so the big question is like, okay, a lot of people think, well, we just need more time. We just need more time. We just need to work the problem. We need more time. So we're just buying time. But the problem is that if it turns out that you don't need more time, if you actually need AI technology of a certain capacity, okay, on top of time, if you need AI technology of a certain capacity to solve alignment, okay, the regulation argument is a disaster. Like, so really what you need to be able to do is to really try to figure out, right, beforehand, is it the case that we need AI of a certain capacity to solve alignment? I think we probably do, okay? I think that we probably do, because it's a foundational knowledge-based problem. And, you know, like AI is an accelerant towards that.
Well, to Steelman Eliezer's case, I would say he thinks that once you get to a certain level of capability, boom, done, we're all dead, it's all over. And that has to be prevented above all else. And the way that we can do that, we have some precedent with international nuclear non-proliferation treaties and drug import and export agreements and such to regulate compute, track all the GPUs sold, add trackers and all the latest NVIDIA drivers, and, you know, drone strike the AI centers. And I mean, it does seem impractical, but Yudkowsky himself admits this. He says like, this is a bad plan. I expect that we all die, but it's like the best that we have. And he still does expect AI alignment research to go on, but in very trusted, secure labs, which I think actually worsens the risk. And you probably agree with that.
Well, I mean, I think I don't know if I would say like I agree or not. I'm just saying that like conditional on these two assumptions, okay? And if like those assumptions are wrong, that's great. I popped champagne, like hooray, like we're in some other regime where I don't have to worry about this. But like where I stand right now, those assumptions seems pretty damn good. Assumption A being that you can't pause AI development across all actors like it's like if you whack one mole down, you're not, there's no way to like act in a way that doesn't have like, counter effects somewhere else. So like if you try to like clamp down research on like this technology that stands to like cure cancer, cure the energy crisis, fix climate change, get us onto Mars, like if you're trying to clamp down that technology curve somewhere on the Earth, like what you're going to end up is you're going to end up having like a counterforce. And what the counterforce is going to be is basically where there's going to be some segment of people who have the will, capacity, belief that that was wrong and that no, we need to keep going. I mean, there's plenty of people today that will come out and say that, right? What percentage of people who are like, self-identifying AI accelerationists who will set up the cruise ship that is like seasteading, that is like doing GPU training off the grid, or who's going to go move their family and their network to some North Korean province to basically like do underground AI training. There are going to be people that are going to do that, right? What's that?
On them, drone strike them.
You're not going to know. This is the whole idea, right? I mean, this is the problem, is that there's no way when you're talking about something that has this kind of incentive and this kind of capacity to be done, there's no way to basically put a plug that's going to stop it from all actors, right? The incentives are just too high. Like the incentives are basically like, for the most cynical point of view, world domination in the hands of them, or the more kind of techno-optimist side, like every day, like, I could steel man the whole argument, like, okay, every day that we slow down AI, some number of people die because like basically we timed it wrong and we were perfectly safe for another decade, but like because these people were so scared, we basically didn't cure cancer 5 years in advance. So like there's going to be plenty of people that like on principle just decide that the regulation is wrong and are going to have a sense of moral duty to continue the train up to the point where they feel it's not safe anymore, right? So that will happen. I think like you're going to see the pressure move somewhere else. You might slow it down a little bit in some way somewhere, but like it's not going to be like this like singular thing that just like clamps it. The pressure is going to flow out and go somewhere else. So yeah, so that's the first.
How worried are you really in the conventional Nick Bostrom, Eliezer Yudkowsky, orthogonality plus instrumental convergence plus capabilities kind of paperclip AI doom scenario? Or really just any scenario where AI leads to the extinction of the human race?
Well, I think I'm very much not worried about like recursive self-improvement or like this kind of like FOOM scenario where like somebody like plugs together a few things and lo and behold, like they unleash the demon. Like I actually really just from an engineering standpoint, I kind of don't think that's really a huge risk at all. I think in practice, there's all these limiting things that you're going to see it kind of get 80% of the way there. People are going to poo their pants or whatever, like, and see like they're about to unleash the demon, right? But we'll know, like, it's not going to be like this kind of thing where we're just tinkering and then all of a sudden the demon pops out. I just don't. I think in practice, there's going to be some rate limiter that's going to basically tell the human that they're about to get their hand burned on the stove. Like that's just the nature of any kind of recurrent process like this. It takes a lot of work to get it to close the loop, and you're going to get closer and closer to closing the loop. And I think the danger will be apparent when you're about to get anywhere near closing the loop. So I think that scenario I'm not that worried about. Now, in terms of like, sorry, go ahead.
I think that also a lot of the early AI safety writings assume that advanced AI, like the first AGI, would be primarily written out of code, be some kind of small computer program, and not giant inscrutable matrices of floating point numbers. So when you have a computer program that's like written like a Python script or something that's 150 IQ, it can rewrite itself to be 155, and then the next version can rewrite itself to be 160, and then before you know it, you accidentally unleash the demon. And I think with neural networks, it would be a lot harder. You have to train entirely new networks. It's compute limited. Sam Altman talks about like it just takes time to build new data centers for like the concrete to dry and the wiring to be added in.
There's tons and tons of inertia across every dimension of like this whole FOOM scenario. And at each point, I mean, I guess one way to put it is like, if you want FOOM to happen, it's going to take a lot of effort to push it. Okay. Like, so you're going to need a lot of people basically pushing as hard as they can to make FOOM happen. And then, yeah, like if you get a lot of people that are pushing and like the demon is like basically right there telling them, oh, I'm about to kill everybody. I'm about to kill everybody. Like, just an analogy, but like, I think that's the regime you're in, is where like, it's going to require a sustained effort to push it over the line for that specific kind of like doomsday scenario. Now, like as far as can neural networks have super intelligent capacity? I think that seems pretty likely to me. Like I think there's definitely arrangements of like neural network substrate running things that you could make theoretically today, that you could bake in the right bits beforehand, and you would have outputs that would be like relatively close to what you would see of like a high IQ or higher IQ human. So I think like the first principles on that are okay. As far as like the risky conjectures part, I'm not so sure, but a lot of intelligence is induction, so I think, and synthesis. So I think that part seems sound. Now I think where things fall apart rapidly for me beyond that though is like trying to basically like guess the outcomes or guess the decision making. Now I haven't read like everything there is to read about this. I know there's like reams and reams of things about this.
Oh,
but
yeah.
no, I mean, the thing that I fall down on is like, I know a lot of these theories that Bostrom and everybody have put forward, they really kind of come at this in a vacuum where they're like trying to reason from first principles, like how these things will act. Which is certainly was an okay thing to do, like for most of the history of AI, when we were just getting our foothold, and like we didn't know like what technology was going to do it. We didn't know like how it was going to work. We didn't know what the kind of base cases were going to look like. But now we actually have a pretty good idea of like what everything is going to be conditioned on, right? So everything is probably going to be conditioned on a situation where these are neural networks. Okay, they're running on silicon. They basically have been trained on a large amount of human generated data. Okay, like human writing, human like thinking out loud. Like I think that's basically given now. There's always some out in left field. Maybe somebody has a totally separate AI development track, and we're going to get to AI, AGI, some other new hill climb happening somewhere else. But it certainly seems like the hill climb is now the base of the hill is like, yeah, you train it on the internet, you train it on all the books, you train it on all the images, you train it on all the stuff humans have ever done. If that's the base case, I think a lot of this reasoning and a lot of this inductive reasoning about like super intelligence just goes completely out the window, because it's basically conditioned. It's not conditioned on all of that. So I think, if you want to start doing that process, fine, but you really do have to go back and you have to like start from a much more refined base case. We're like, okay, assuming it's neural networks, assuming it's on GPUs, assuming it takes this amount of energy, assuming it's going to have this kind of flops, assuming it's going to be trained on the internet, assuming it's going to have this kind of latent space encoding style of all these things, assuming there's an ecosystem of like the internet, software, all these things around it. Okay, what kind of super intelligence do we expect to pop out of that? What kind of like constraints will it have on its goals and all of these things? Like, so I think that's to me where like we're really in the unknowable territory. Like, I mean, certainly somebody could maybe make an argument, maybe I'll be persuaded about it, but for me, like I don't really feel any reason to say anything about it, because I just don't think there's any way to get enough of a foothold to make any kind of like sane predictions about the nature of such a super intelligence, like what it's going to do, what the effect is going to be on us, how we're going to interact with it, like what it's going to want to do or not want to do. I just feel like we're so outside of the realm of being able to make reasonable predictions about that I just kind of blank out. I'm just like, okay, let's like not worry about that right now. Let's worry about the things that we have much more certainty about, that, by the way, basically motivate everything exactly the same, right? It's like, instead of fighting over things in this very unknowable regime, let's like look at the things that most people can see are coming and like realize, oh my God, we actually have to do the same thing we were going to do if that was true, but we need to do it a lot sooner, actually, if we want to avoid some like legit crisis this decade. So that's kind of how I come down on it. I mean, yeah, I don't think it really animates too much in terms of human action, right? I think it actually might just be undermining human action right now.
So I understand that this is a little bit of a Bayesian LARP, but if you had to come up with a number to represent your aggregate probability of doom from AI before the year 2100, doom meaning human extinction or something very close to it, what do you think you would say? Obviously, it's impossible to know.
I mean, I think right now my probability of like the chain of stuff leading to human extinction is extraordinarily low, right? And I'll explain why. Okay, so the first reason is that I think, conditional on the idea that there's literally any civilization that was within reach of us, you know, within our light cone or whatever, like, some margin of that, I think we will be stopped from unleashing any kind of existential risk to anybody off of Earth. I think that will basically is guaranteed. Okay. So, maybe we're completely alone within that region, like whatever the fastest you can get some kind of interventionary mechanism to us. But like, conditional on us not being the only like life form of advanced intelligence, we will be stopped by definition because it's in their self-interest to stop us. So I think that already cuts down a lot of my probability. Now, of course, there's scenarios where we, build some AI system that blows up Earth but doesn't risk anybody else. But like, I don't know that from like an interventionist standpoint, if you're going to really like mess around with that. Like, if we present any X risk to anybody else in the galaxy or outside the galaxy within that region, like they're going to stop us from touching anything that could be close to unleashing that, and anything that would kill everybody on Earth, I think would be close enough that they probably would like intervene before then, right? So that's just like one big cut down. The second cut down is like, I think the alignment by default thing, certainly has some merit. So it might mean that alignment is actually relatively easy, not hard. So that's another big cut down. The second is that I do think that basically there might be some like latent like limiter, right? There might be some like intelligence ceiling that comes along that like basically just turns out we can't get past a certain ceiling. That's another one. Then the Foom takeoff scenario is obviously the one that really is like rattling in terms of this kind of X-risk scenario, since we have no time to react and adjust what we're doing. And so that scenario I think is very, very low likelihood. So I think that also cuts down my risks. So I don't know. I mean, the scenario where I think we could be extinct from this is like if the Foom thing is way more likely than I thought, if we're completely alone and there's no conscious life anywhere within us that we pose any risk to at all, and there is some like very clean path to getting some kind of runaway like thing in the next couple of years that'll like surprise us all very quickly. I don't think that's very likely. Like I think it's much more likely that any of those other things are true, and then basically like we might have a situation where some really bad stuff happens, like there's crisis, and certainly maybe there's like some large scale like cataclysmic type things going on locally, where like we get like a virus outbreak or something like this type of scale event. But I think as long as there's a margin for us to course correct and react to it as a species, I'm not like, I mean, to be completely clear, like we're talking about like complete eradication of humanity. So like that's a very specific condition. Like I really do think there's going to be like some seriously massively bad shit that's going to happen like pretty soon. And like that is like very, very not like this. I'm not happy about that. But as far as like the very specific condition where like, the AI just like destroys everything, that to me is pretty tough. Like I think it's pretty damn low, like less than 1%.
So one last question about AI before we move on. Effective accelerationism, EAC, is really having its moment right now. All kinds of people on tech Twitter, Gary Tan, who's the head of Y Combinator, Mark Andreessen, who's the head of Andreessen Horowitz, and lots of other people are putting EAC in their bios. So 3 months ago, long before it was as famous, you tweeted, quote, EAC is a dumb philosophy and is going to generate as many zealots as Yodism. Throw it into the dustbin. So do you still think this? And can you elaborate on that a little?
Yeah, so I mean, I think fundamentally, right, what motivates EAC, I mean, I don't want to speak too generally, but the thing that disturbs me about it is, it's fundamentally rooted in a reactionary response to like this idea that we're going to regulate technology and slow it down, right? And particularly AI, but it's also kind of a response to like degrowthism and all this. And I think there's really kind of two major things that concern me about it. So the first is that any kind of reactionary philosophy that is basically like conjured up to kind of like quell what is perceived as a major risk to like a tangible risk that specific humans are doing to like our future. This is just like a recipe for like zealotry and like radicalization. Right now, a lot of these kind of philosophical debates going on like in AI they're very narrowly happening on Twitter among, technical types and these kinds of people. And there's really no risk of these kinds of like seriously dangerous consequences of this debate at this stage. But I think one of the things I worry about, having grown up through, 40 years of internet stuff now, like there's a tendency for like things that started on the internet among like geeks to kind of once in a while explode out and become part of the, international zeitgeist. And, EAC as a moral philosophy, as a kind of motivating, principled, reactionary philosophy is the kind of thing that if it does end up getting taken seriously by the mainstream and it does become a kind of, way of living, it'll harden up a little bit. But it is the kind of thing that I could imagine some radical segments kind of adopting and acting on like their worst tendencies to kind of harm others and things like this. So that's what I meant by that, is that if you're going to position yourself as a philosophy that is trying to prevent an existentially bad outcome for humanity, and you're saying that that's, it's like life or death. Like if the AI doomers basically cause the country to regulate AI, they're basically like dooming humanity. Like that is not the recipe for clear-headed thinking, and it's not the recipe for avoiding zealots from infiltrating your movement and hijacking it away from you to basically turn it into a violent, movement. That to me is like very not a good recipe. And I think part of the reason that I also reacted that way is because I really do think that this techno optimist point of view like isn't necessarily one that you need to have a reactionary philosophy. I mean, like, we've talked about knowledge accelerationism and things like this, and so I think that does provide a more kind of like, if you want to make the analogy, it's kind of like a liberalizing approach where like you're trying to make it into a positive some type of situation where it's about not necessarily kind of an adversarial situation, right? You're not really trying to like defeat some opposing force through that philosophy. You're trying to basically build up some kind of positive sum situation where all things are getting better and like we all have kind of an aligned goal of improving our understanding of the world and all that kind of thing. And I've seen like the EAC philosophy is trying to dialectically figure out what it actually is, what it actually isn't. I kind of reacted negatively to it from the beginning because I saw that kind of like reactionary. I think there's this like recipe of like animating people through like a sense of a combination of fear and righteousness, right? So like that's kind of going on right now on both sides of the AI debate, right? You have you have doomers who are obviously animated by fear, and some of them are like I saw one person, I won't name who it is, but like there is a little twinge of righteousness that I hadn't seen before, where basically like the mantle of taking up the mantle that they are a scientific they're taking a scientific approach, and if you are not agreeing with their conclusions, you're not taking a scientific approach to the problem, you're like anti-science. I saw like a twinge of that coming out, and like that would be an example where like you could see like a sense of, I don't think this is really happening on a large scale, to be clear, but that's like where you could see a sense of righteousness come into the AI doomer side of things, which I haven't really seen before, where there's like we know we are right, and there's a certain kind of entitlement that comes along with that I think there's still a good amount of humility in the bucket there, that I don't have a lot of sense of concern about that, but it's that like fear and righteousness thing, whereas EAC has both, right? It has a sense of fear because there's a sense of fear that the if AI accelerationists or decelerationist succeed, then you're going to end up in this like dystopian hellhole where like they're basically regulating all GPUs. You can't even like do matrix multiplies in your living room anymore because the government's going to come and like take your GPUs away. So that's animating a sense of fear. And then there's a sense of righteousness in the sense that like we're on the side of like causing humanity to succeed and explore the stars. You guys want to drag us down and slow everything down and like prevent our children from inheriting their cosmic endowment or whatever. So like you do have like this recipe for like zealotry and radicalization, and it's just it's just an ugly kind of mix of things that like I was kind of disappointed to see it kind of gain increasing momentum, because it just feels like it's not really where like I I've known a lot of like really smart technical people for a long time, and like they are really good natured techno optimist people. They really want people to be like happy and fulfilled and flourishing. And the EAC stuff just, it really feels like there's some kind of latent like vileness to it that like I just never really liked from the beginning. It's just kind of like
Actually,
an
Actually, I think EAC has gotten kind of tempered recently because they used to be all about like, oh, we need to serve the thermodynamic god and increase the entropy of the universe and fulfill our destiny and all that. And now, like with such mainstream people embracing it, it's kind of just like cooled down to a general sense of techno optimism. I mean, I'll admit, I bought an EAC shirt with the like effective accelerationism logo with the exponential on it because it looks so cool. Um,
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's
I
always
hope,
a lot of dimensions to this stuff, right? I mean, like when I talk about critiquing this stuff, okay, I'm coming at it from the point of like moral philosophy and like thinking about how it can inform you and like how you ought to live and what you ought to prioritize and how you ought to think about your place in terms of like what animates you to do what you do, right? So like if you're coming in and you have a philosophy of an adversarial nature where it's like I get up because I want this other thing to stop, okay, I will get up because I want this other person to not do what they're doing, like from a moral philosophical sense, like I'm not a fan of those kinds of moral philosophies. Like, you know, OG Marxism was like, we need to like stop the capitalists from doing what they're doing because it's like an evil force, right? Like that kind of moral philosophy, like for me personally, I don't like it. And I also think it kind of tends to bring out the worst in people. So that's when I'm critiquing EAC, I'm not critiquing like the individuals, the people that are basically like trying to figure this out and the memes and the like, the discourse that comes out of a lot of it. I really think though that like as soon as you position something as, which it seems to be positioned as, like a moral philosophy, a ideological movement, okay, as soon as you do that, you're telling me that like, okay, I need to take it seriously. Okay, well, if you want me to take it seriously, I'm going to take it seriously. And like, if it's just like, because look, I have an MFR 3D NFT guy in my thing. I like have all these like ridiculous like hashtags, but like very few of these things are in this bucket where it's like, this is like people telling me how we ought to live. Okay. So if you're going to say that that's like what you're actually trying to do, okay, now you're operating up here. You're operating at the top of the stack. Okay. Like, or the bottom of the stack, depending on how you want to think about it. But like, you're at root. Okay. Moral philosophy drives everything. Like how people think about what their meaning is in life, how they think about what they ought to do, how they think about their place in the world and the purpose of the human experience. That is the highest lever that we have, that we've seen drives humanity. And so if you're going to enter and put a chip on the board that says, okay, this is a new chip for this domain, you're going to get my most critical feedback. Okay. You're not going to get me like shit posting or whatever. You're going to get me saying like, no, this is a fucking dead end. You should stop doing this. You should think about these other ways to do it. Because if you actually let your little experiment get out of the lab, what you're going to get is you're going to get a massacre. You're going to get like bombings. You're going to get like violence. You're going to get war. Okay. So like you don't fuck around with like these kinds of moral philosophically like kind of things unless you're really, really serious and you've really, really thought about it and you've really run the simulation in your head out to like, what if like 99% of humans all have adopted your philosophy? Like, what does that look like? So that's where I start to like really start to, come in hard on these kinds of things.
yeah,
And I think in this case, that's kind of where I am on this one. This one is just not a good idea. This is something that should just basically be, to use it should be accelerated to its endpoint sooner, right? If I'm wrong and it turns out that this moral philosophy is one that is really great for humanity, then let's accelerate it either way. But I think if we accelerate it either way, it needs to accelerate to the point where it just implodes on itself, because I think that's where it ends up. Now, maybe it'll implode and it'll turn into something else. People will dialectically revolve it to something. Maybe they'll find like, oh yeah, it turns out David Deutsch figured this shit all out like a while ago. That guy
yeah.
actually had it figured out. So let's go do that. Like maybe that's how it goes. I don't know. But I think you want to hit the gas on it so that it basically just peters out if that's its destination versus, kind of slow boil up to the point where kind of people are using it as a tribal signal to start, right? Like, like you raise the flag, you like sing the songs, you like know the handshakes. But then, like, you know, everything behind that is now everyone's reading the book together, everyone's reading the manifesto, right? Like
Yeah.
that hasn't been written yet. But when you get to a certain scale, people demand to know what the moral philosophy is. How should I get up in the morning? What should I work on? Should I do my should I go to the gym? Should I not go to the gym? Should I tie my shoes? Should I not tie my shoes? Like, this stuff is serious stuff. So I think that's kind of like I think that's kind of like why I think it needs to just be like really, really critically you know, just talked about, and just let's really run it down to its inductive end as fast as we can.
You know, in a way, the whole EAC versus Doomer thing reminds me a lot of like reactionary anti-wokes against people who they perceive to be woke. In both cases, you have a group of people who just cannot stand being talked down to by people who they perceive as condescending and moralizing and standing in the way of progress. And so they go too far in the opposite direction. Um,
Yeah,
and
I mean, I think,
pretty
you know,
bad
there's another like latent variable to this, right? Where there's definitely like ideological groups, right? Like where they are effectively like bad actors, right? They're like subversive. They're basically trying to like parlay some judo move to try to like gain power. Like, there's definitely ideological groups of that kind. I genuinely don't see AI doomers in this category, right? So like that's a particularly like a large like, you know, scale factor in like how much tolerance I have for like some kind of reactionary counterforce to them, right? Like where you're being asked like, no, like these people are like, you know, really dangerous. You really need to like do everything in your power to stop them. Like they're going to get us all really, really hurt. Like this is really, really bad. I think at the end of the day, like for me to get behind that kind of mentality, like I need to be very much convinced that the people we're talking about are like legitimate enemies of humanity. Like they're literally like subversive. They're literally trying to like, you know, they have a hidden agenda. Like, and I'm just really not there with like a lot of the people who are cautioning us on AI. I think they have some fundamentally wrong assumptions. I think they have some fundamentally reasonable assumptions. I think their tactics and their strategy have been horrible if they actually want to like de-risk this whole situation. I know people think they're making progress, but the problem is that the reactionary forces they've conjured up are part of the consequences of their actions. You know, really like you don't get, you know, you can look and say, okay, well, they're getting like progress on the regulatory front. They're getting people to believe what they're saying. But, you know, you're also getting like reactionaries reactions. That's an unforced error. I really do think that there was a scenario here where, you know, a year ago, that if people who were on the side of AI being extremely risky, they could have constructed a whole different approach that would have cleaved off way more people that would have otherwise ended up in these like extreme reactionary kind of points of view that would have made this way less contentious and would have made it. I mean, some of the stuff I was talking about, like just like let's start with the stuff people can agree on and then really acknowledge it instead of it being this like very extreme outcome kind of scenario. So I think so yeah, there's a lot of like, you know, just unforced errors and things like this that I think they've made, and but I don't think that they're like bad actors, and I don't think that they're subversive or any of this.
I think it is interesting that Eliezer Yudkowsky was like the original EAC. Like if you go back to his pre-2001 writings, Staring into the Singularity, The Meaning of Life, like his goal originally with Miri was to create and bootstrap and like an AGI by himself that would be, you know, formally aligned, a formally aligned singleton, and basically take over the world and save the world. Which
Yeah,
is, you know, of course he ended up not doing that. He ended up totally pivoting it. But it is interesting that he did that in the first place. Um,
yeah.
so
I mean, I understand like the chain of reasoning, right? I mean, I think there's really just some fundamental assumptions that are different, and I might be wrong. Like maybe I haven't thought about it enough, you know. But ultimately, like I don't know. I still generally think that the odds of us ultimately, if you run all the simulations down of these kind of like extreme cataclysmic events, are very, very low. And you have to zoom out and really think about things from like a galactic scale to really get there. But but I do think, you know, I'm kind of like one of these weird people where like you know, if I talk to AI doomers, they're going to think I'm an accelerationist. And if I talk to accelerationists, they're going to think I'm an AI
Yeah,
doomer,
I've
right?
seen that.
So,
So
I mean, I basically have this like very kind of like synthesized view, which happens to be a little bit of both. But like the reason I'm there is because I want to motivate a way to talk about things that can basically solve what we actually know we ought to know. We ought to all know what we need to solve. And it's frustrating when you see people that like really they should know that there's certain problems that exist and need to be solved. And they just don't or are dismissing them because they're kind of jumping ahead to like, okay, well, if I acknowledge that problem is real, I think this is a common thing. Okay, I'll just go off for a second. Like, I think there's this common thing where like, once you've gotten into this kind of tribal war, right? If you go and you like say to a person, I need you to acknowledge that the risk from AI is like significant in X, Y, and Z ways. Okay. Now what's happened is that like there's a certain point where that person like will front run if they admit to certain things that it's going to be exploited. Okay. And I hate that people have to feel that way. But like, you know, there's a lot of people that think, oh, if I admit that like there's a significant risk of some kind of like really, really bad agentic AI scenario, then what's going to happen is my enemies are going to like use that as an excuse. They're going to package it up into a proposal and they're going to cause GPUs to get regulated because I admitted that, right? And like that is not the path to like problem solving and clear thinking. So I've been really trying to find a way to construct a framing of the argument and a framing of the proposals that is like engineered not just upon what I actually think, but also one that like hopefully can like fit into the mental models of both sides such that there can be some kind of consensus around like not the silver bullet, but like what are some things that we should all agree like make sense to do, or like unforced errors that we should all agree we should definitely like avoid not doing.
yeah.
Right.
So on a different topic, you seem to be relatively convinced that there are aliens, extraterrestrial life, relatively close to Earth, that they visited Earth before, that the government is aware of this, and that the government is concealing this from the general public. So can you explain some of your reasoning on that?
That's not exactly what I think. So I think here's what I'll say that I think is almost certainly true. Okay. So I think it's almost certainly true. I'm like basically near 100% that there are some kind of like metallic objects that have been like moving around in the atmosphere that have been seen by pilots and have been seen by aviators for a long time that exhibit, at a minimum, extreme accelerations that basically cannot be really explained as, you know, human created technology. I think I'm fairly convinced that that's true. The second thing that I'm convinced of is that there are some actors in the US government that they themselves believe that they've proven that this is the case. Okay. So like that's kind of like the limit of like where I'm really certain. Like I really do think that those things are flying around up there. And I really do think that, you know, some of them are up there. And I really do think that, you know, they're not Chinese drones, they're not like, you know, geese flying around or whatever Mick West says. Like I think there's definitely some objects up there that have been seen by human eyes that that have demonstrated like really insane accelerations. Okay.
Yeah, in today's congressional hearing, some whistleblower said that the U.S. government, like for sure, has craft of non-human origin, and I mean, naturally, myself and plenty of other people are skeptical of it because Sagan's rule that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. So, what brought you to this conclusion that this is actually real and not people like seeing it wrong or people trying to lie for clout or whatever?
So, I mean, the specific situation where there are these objects seen by pilots, seen by military aviators for a long time that do this. The reason I became convinced of that is just due to the preponderance of expert witness, like, you know, journalism and, you know, just evidence that there are pilots that have seen things that they describe in this way. And at a certain point, there's various events in history where like, you know, military aviators have engaged these things. So like there's not really like a lot of room across all of that, that there's no incidents where there was an actual object doing some crazy stuff in the eye, like in front of these aviators. Now, like when you're talking about people on the ground with their phone or like looking up at the sky, I don't really incorporate like any of that into my priors, really. I really kind of like am looking at like the baseline minimum of what I think is true. And what I think is true is that there are these objects moving around up there doing like insane accelerations that, you know, aviators with like many, many years of experience with military training, with high classified clearances have come to believe that they've seen. And there's enough of those that I'm convinced that there's something to that thing, that there are real things doing that, right?
So if there are advanced aliens out there who would be sending some kind of spacecraft to Earth, why would they be sending giant detectable objects and not some tiny thing the size of like a bacterium that can just quietly surveil us without us ever knowing?
Right. Okay. So let me just, so that's my first belief that I think is very much true. My second, and there's a bunch of other stuff that like I have mixed priors on about all this, but that's the one I'm pretty solid on. And then the other one that I'm pretty solid on is that there are people within the government who have seen the evidence, seen the data on that specifically, and have been convinced that it's demonstrated non-human technology. Okay. So that's basically the two things I'm like really, really sure of. So now the question is like, okay, well, if that's true, what's going on? Okay.
Yes.
So basically, I had no really good explanation for this, and I still don't know if this is a good one. Okay. But I've been trying to figure out like, okay, what could it be that would like explain this situation? And the best explanations for this are ones that seem like they're obviously the case with like a certain amount of induction from like very, very obvious first principles. Okay. So now basically the first principle here is like, it ends up being about AI. And I kind of think, you know, I'm not the first to think of this, but I kind of independently thought of it, and it kind of made it click for me. Like, okay, I basically believe this is what's going on. So basically, I think at a minimum, okay, this doesn't explain everything. This is just the tip of the iceberg. But like, if you believe as an assumption that neural network systems can basically generate intelligence, okay, and I have a certain capacity, then the risk of a extra Earth impact of this technology being developed on Earth seems non-zero. Okay. Now there's a big difference between saying like, oh, like, you know, Elizer's like, we're all gonna die because of this. That's like a high 100% certainty. But this is like the inverse case. This is where it's at least an epsilon. Okay, it's not zero. So from the standpoint of an external observer, if a planet can basically produce any risk at all of harming you at a distance, that planet is not just an interest, but now you have the entire problem of like all the planets pose a non-zero risk to you. Okay, I think that that's actually the case. I think from a human standpoint right now, we can say this is the case, that all planets that are within some like reasonable like light speed radius of us like expose us to some non-zero risk of them harming us. Because if they create some kind of like, you know, intelligence in their systems that can self-replicate and decide it wants to destroy us, okay, destroy all life in the galaxy or something, like it could, okay. So I think that that's like basically true. I think that like we do know today that there is non-zero risk presented to us from other planets, if there's any chance that they have any life on them at all.
So earlier you said that your priors for AI doom are very low because reason number one was other civilizations in our local area would know that and try to take measures to prevent it. But what if the measures to prevent it are they send over the Death Star and blow us up? That seems to be the easiest way to do it, no?
Well, I mean, that's the thing people say, but I think that the trick there is you smuggled in the word easy, right? If you're an actual advanced civilization, okay, there is no easy or hard. You just choose what you want to do, okay? And really when you're choosing what you want to do, your optimization is not about like, oh, is this going to take effort on our part? We just say what we want. So you're really now you're kind of stuck in a scenario where you kind of have to like try to guess what's the ethics or what's the like motives of of an external civilization with regards to external X risk. So I think, but anyway, just where I ended up was like, because I think what's going to happen is if humans cross the chasm and end up building these AI systems, and we manage to align them and they all work, okay, we immediately have to do this thing, which I think has already happened, which is we need to build a system that goes out and basically monitors every single possible place life could be in the galaxy that we can't get to fast enough to stop, okay? And we're going to need to build those things, and we're going to need to send them out. We're going to need to do this within like 100 years tops. I mean, we absolutely need to do this.
That kind of sounds like Bukowski's idea of a pivotal act.
Maybe. I mean, I think it's just a species level demand. Like we actually have to do it if we want to expect to survive. It's like another form of risk. Like we need to build an anti-asteroid system. We need to be able to get off the Earth. We need to be able to prevent the sun from consuming us by getting away from it. We also need to basically deploy a system that hopefully we deploy early enough. And maybe if we're first, we can get to every single planet in time to basically monitor it and prevent them from unleashing some kind of feedback cycle, whether it's AI or something else that will kill us, right? So we need to do that. Now the question is, are we the first to do that or are we not? I think the odds of us being the first to do that are pretty slim. It's not a zero, but like if we aren't the first ones to do that, then you ought to expect to find things flying around probably of some kind that are basically keeping an eye on stuff. Now, okay, what's that?
So the Fermi paradox.
Well, the Fermi paradox goes away, right? I mean, the Fermi paradox is like a bunch of bullshit. It turns out we've had evidence of aliens here the whole time.
Yeah. It seems like the most plausible answer that most people agree on with the Fermi paradox. I am kind of agnostic because there's just no evidence one way or another. It's competing explanations. But the theory that Earth is early and that there are no other aliens out there, or if they are, they're bacteria or something billions of light years away, and we're just super early. So,
well, I mean, the Fermi paradox, like the Fermi paradox is conditional on the idea that you don't observe aliens, right? I mean, if you observe aliens, you have the solution. You're not first. If you don't observe aliens, the question is, okay, well, why the hell could that be? And I think, yeah, like certainly it could be the case that you're early and you can make an inductive argument like with grabby aliens that, okay, yes, we should assume we're early because, given we don't see aliens, like these kinds of chains of probabilistic things would imply that we basically are the earliest within our light cone or whatever. But I think I think if we're not the first to be able to do things, even if, because a lot of people think, okay, well, if there were aliens, we would see all this other stuff. Okay. I don't know that I have any reason to think we'd see anything, but what we should see at a minimum, okay, is we should see something here on Earth, which has the goal of basically ensuring it has full observability on us to make sure that we don't ever cross some threshold that could confer harm to anybody else in the galaxy or within this like region. I think that that is like the minimum thing. Now, yeah, okay, you asked okay, why are they like not smaller, all this other stuff. I can't really answer that, okay? I mean, there's a lot of second order things that now you're in this really kind of fuzzy epistemic zone where okay, there's a lot of stuff I don't have an explanation for, and everything I said could be completely wrong. But where I came down on this issue is that there is at least one minimum motivating cause for why you ought to expect to see some non-human technology at Earth, okay? Because a lot of people are like, oh, they're tourists, they're coming to visit us, they're coming to look at us, all this other stuff. That all sounded silly to me until I realized there is a strong motivating thing that would cause non-human technology to be at Earth. And it's a self-preservation motivation, and we will develop technology to do this to somebody else very soon. So that's why none of this stuff surprised me. Now, the thing is though, right, is that a lot of the stuff going on in the last couple of days have blown up all of my priors over this. I have no reason to believe that there's alien bodies. I have no reason to believe that there's crashed UFOs in this hypothesis. None of that stuff falls out of this naturally from those assumptions. So all of that could be true. It could not be true.
Yeah.
I mean,
it does seem a little weird that the aliens would send actual squishy biological aliens instead of a drone. Like, why would they do
Yeah, I
that?
mean, I can make up reasons, but none of them really are as strong to me as the base case assumption, which is that if we are, unless we are the very first civilization that exists, not in the galaxy per se, but in the radius of exhibiting harm to other actors, like we ought to expect to find evidence of non-human technology, unless you think like, there's some way that those are like completely hidden from us. Now, here's the other thing. Okay, here's the other thing I'll say. This does oversimplify stuff because that's the beginning of the causal chain. Like, if it turns out, okay, we ought to expect there to be non-human technology at Earth. If you start there, that doesn't necessarily mean that all the observables, all the things we're talking about, like large UFO type things or biological aliens or any of that, are those things. Okay, that doesn't mean that those are the same things, but it does imply that perhaps what's going on is that, yes, the base case is true. There's non-human technology at Earth. Maybe we can't even see it. Okay, that is here for this purpose. Okay, that to me is inductive from those very basic assumptions. Okay, so that to me seems strongly likely to be the case. Everything else might be a inductive result of that consequence played out over like millions of years with like bazillions of actors, that like it incidentally looks chaotic to us. Like, it looks like it makes no sense, but there might be some like both parochial and like inductive things that led to that kind of stability point. Like, it could turn out that if every planet in the galaxy has some type of like non-visible observation system on it, okay, it could turn out that a consequential corollary of that is you get large like anti-gravity orbs with humanoids flying around in them. Like, maybe there's some chain of causality there. I don't know, right? But as soon as you've kind of broken through and you've said, yes, no, the situation should be that there's non-human technology at every, like there's technology on every planet that has life, and there's non-human technology on Earth. As soon as you've like crashed through that window, now like you should expect all kinds of insane shit. And so like basically like maybe it turns out there's some very weird causal chain that causes those other weird things to come along for the ride. And maybe at first that wasn't how it was, but then maybe like over time events happened and that came along for the ride.
Yeah.
It's an iceberg of consequences that would come if it turns out at the minimum there's some non-human technology at Earth.
So you seem to be a bit worried about UAPs, unidentified aerial phenomena. When you tweet about it, it seems to be. I think you said something today along the lines of like we should treat the results of the UAP hearings like we would treat the results of a biopsy. So if they're here to solve the alignment problem for us and not to blow us up, then where exactly does the worry come from? Simply the unknown?
Well, I mean, I think what I would say is that it's not necessarily one dynamic. I think there's probably some latent capacity of this to not necessarily solve the alignment problem for us, but de-risk us from everybody else. Okay, I think that's the minimum demand of my hypothesis, is that there's something that's a non-human technology that's at Earth to de-risk us from everybody else. Okay, so now the question is how ought to we what should we expect things to be like if it turns out that's true, and it turns out that there's even more things that are going on that maybe, like I said, are not necessarily that system but some inductive kind of things. Okay, now the way I think about this, okay, and this is kind of pulling in all the other allegations and like putting some like non-zero probability on them, like some low, some high, but the way I think about this now is kind of from a different angle. Okay, so regardless of whether or not this stuff going on is like entirely about de-risking us or not, or it's only a bit about that, and there's a bunch of other stuff, surprising corollaries to that. The thing I see that's the elephant in the room is that this really looks to be like, if this stuff does come spilling out, that the government has done an insanely good job of covering it up using a like large variety of like methods, right? So they've used, the kind of half disinformation thing where they've let a lot of things out. Some of them, I mean, this is all conditional on it coming out that this is true. Okay, so like if this comes out that it's true, well, then it turns out that a lot of the stuff we were told that was true, and then a bunch of it was nonsense, right? And it was all mixed together into this like amorphous blob where we can't make sense of anything. So that's one thing that they would have done if it turns out this is true. Another thing is there's a bunch of people that didn't talk. So like if a bunch of people didn't talk for 80 years, the low-level minions probably didn't talk because they were like fearful of consequences to them from their superiors, or allegedly there were death threats and things like this. We'll see if that turns out to be true. But then there's a lot of people all the way up, right, that didn't talk about this, right? And, always talk about it at glancing angles. Now, I mean, the unfortunate thing I conclude from this is that kind of insane cover-up is not about conspiracy, okay? Like, I think Naval put it best, is like, you don't need a conspiracy when you have incentives, okay? You can definitely hold together like a short-term conspiracy of a small number of actors, but to really get to a point where you've like done this kind of like insanely effective and consistent and deep and long campaign to keep so many people in the dark and scrambling to make sense of everything and completely in a state of mania. I mean, these people that have been like following this stuff, like, and really like living this, they like don't know what to believe about anything. They've just been completely turned into crazy people, some of them, because like, what's that?
Tinfoil hats.
Well, it's just like, you don't know what to make sense. You're being fed lies, you're being fed true things you don't know anymore, right?
This is where the original tinfoil hat meme came from, right?
Oh, is that true?
Something like that. Like people wearing a tinfoil hat to like protect themselves from aliens or something.
So, I mean, like, the way I look at it though is like, if you have this kind of like, I mean, unparalleled successful cover up, okay, like it like totally blows the doors off anything else in terms of just know it. Because I mean, think about it, right? It's not like the JFK thing or any of these other classic conspiracy theories. If you literally have a situation where the entire public has legitimate capacity to collect their own evidence, so you like, if this turns out to be true, a chunk of those cell phone videos are real. A chunk of these maybe abduction stories are real. A chunk of everything you've heard, maybe there's some of it that turned out to be real true. This is the kind of cover up that they needed to do, where like it wasn't just like something that happened and is over. It's like an ongoing thing. The public has some capacity for evidence collection. You need like this massive, massive amount of incentives for like people to be really hardcore about like executing on operations to kind of ensure that stuff remains right? So anyway, that's just to tee up like my argument, which is that if it turns out this stuff is true, and you had this kind of insanely successful cover up that like did this to everybody for so long, in light of the difficulty of that, you really need some insanely good incentives, okay? And the only kind of incentives I could imagine could lead to this kind of outcome are not ones where like somebody's fearful of their own life, okay? Not even ones where they're fearful of the lives of the ones they care about, okay? Because over 80 years, if you're talking about this kind of secret, some crazy MFer is going to decide, you know what, they're lying. I don't believe that they're going to like kidnap my kids or whatever. I think I'm going to just like tell everybody and just roll the dice because this is too important.
Well, is that what's happening now with the whistleblowers?
Well, I'll get to that in a second. But like, I think for this kind of cover up to have worked, you needed everybody who was read in on it to actually believe that if this leaked, everybody was going to die. Okay. I think that's actually the only real, not everybody was going to die, but that it was going to be really, really bad for everybody if this leaked. Okay. Maybe everybody was going to die. Maybe we thought maybe society was going to collapse. And they didn't need to just like kind of half believed it. They needed to be sure. Okay. Now, that's why, now look, I hope I'm wrong. Okay. I hope that the cover up is just bureaucrats and people in the military being like, we don't want the Russians to find out first, or like, we don't want our national security to be at risk. But like, if I'm right, what it was like, no, like, this is no joke. Like, if this gets out, like everything I know, everything I love, everyone I know, everything's going to end. Okay. In some existential way. That's what I think. What's that?
World's biggest info hazard.
Right. Like, this is the kind of thing you would need to get this kind of outcome. If it's true and it's not some crazy PSYOP CIA thing, if it's true, that's the kind of incentive you needed for no single person to really just like blow the doors off of it, like, and make it their thing. Now, the question is, okay, why is this changing now? Okay. Well, okay. that isn't good news either. Like, if it turns out that I'm right and that what motivated this was a sense of existential dread about what would occur if it came out, you have to ask yourself, okay, well, was the existential dread mitigated? Is it now safe to talk about it? Are the people who previously thought that it was this kind of thing no longer concerned? I mean, I hope so. I hope that's what it is, right? That's the best case scenario. Okay, it turns out they were going to vaporize us, or we were in a zoo or something, and then look, we just like cracked, superconductors or something, and now that's the key to unlock the door, and like now we're cool. We could say this is real, and we're all going to be happy. I hope that's the case. Okay.
Yeah.
But what I think is actually going on is the game theory changed, and the people who basically were measuring whether or not we needed to learn about what was really going on with all this, decided that now time is important. The time variable has suddenly appeared, and now it makes more sense from a maximization of human wellness standpoint to actually tell us. Okay.
Well, if the aliens were concerned about us developing AI soon or some kind of other very risky technologies, and the aliens are some light years away from us, why would they start worrying now and not like 50 years ago or 500 or 5,000 years ago? I mean, maybe like if we're leaning into the some alien conspiracies, maybe real evidence, maybe Roswell actually was aliens, and maybe the aliens actually did help build the pyramids.
I mean, I don't think they worry about us at all, right? I think they know exactly what we're going to do if they're out there. And I think they're just, they're just letting shit roll out the way that they expect. I mean, basically, it's not too hard to predict what we're going to figure out and when we're going to figure it out. I think if they've seen the chain of, like, it's like we can't predict knowledge a priori that we're going to generate. But if somebody else has already done all the work and knows what you need to have as a precondition, they can predict our goddamn tech tree probably within months of advance, right? So basically, what I think is that they're not worried about us, right? But there's probably some orchestrated sequence of events, and like there's some kind of urgency right now. I don't know what the urgency would be. The urgency is not about probably them doing anything per se on their worry scale. Like they're not more worried now, and now like they need to do something. They already have everything planned out. The urgency is on our side. There's something about this current moment. Again, I have to keep saying it because I don't want people to think I'm like certain of any of this, but like just running from my assumptions. The urgency now is on our side. Like there's something that is causing our government to decide that now, okay, there's a timetable for which the public needs to become aware of this. Now, like there's a whole spectrum of possibilities. I can like speculate. Like, for example, if it turns out that it's going to be the case that there's certain things we're not allowed to do, okay? Like, people are not going to accept the government just saying like, hey, Elon Musk, that whole Mars mission you want to do? Yeah, you can't do that. We said so. Like, people are not going to tolerate that. But like, if it turns out that we're like not allowed to go to Mars because like it's against the plan, then like they actually need to tell us, because there's going to be like a war if we're told we can't like shoot rockets to Mars, right? And put people there at some point. I mean, that's just a guess, right? I don't think that's really what's going on, but it's just
I doubt they box us into our planet and not like the solar system, at least.
Yeah. I'm just kind of framing the structure of a situation.
Yeah, I get it. And also, what do you believe about the alien zoo hypothesis? Which
I think that's actually most likely one to me, like right now, that's like consistent with like all of the evidence and everything. Like, I think the most likely scenario is that basically there's some urgency around the fact that we need to know that we can't do certain stuff because we're basically a subservient species. Like we basically are either being protected or we're being like kept under some kind of like safety zone. I don't know what it is, but like I think there's just there's a point. I mean, if you zoom out and you think about the general structure of this kind of thing, you have a situation where like a species is basically doing stuff on their planet, and then they start to do stuff. I'm not talking about like the AI side of X risk to other people. I'm talking about a scenario where there's a envelope of shielding by a higher power around the Earth, right? So the species are just doing some stuff. Then they start to like hurt themselves quite a bit, and like it's kind of interesting. We want to make sure they don't like completely destroy their planet. But then like they start to get to a point where they can like kind of get out over their skis. Like they can start to like really fuck up things for everybody else, or they can start to like get out past the point where they can really be like kind of reined in, and like we can know where they all are, and we can like basically like keep them like bounded in terms of what they're doing. And like it just feels like, on a variety of fronts, we're like kind of poking holes in like that kind of regime. Like as soon as we're going towards anything that's like extra planet, like in terms of either projecting risk, projecting force, projecting like expansionism, projecting like anything like that. If we're in any kind of like enclosed planetary scale bounding kind of situation, that would be when you would expect this kind of news to become necessary to tell the public, right?
Yeah.
Because humans are going to be limited in their agency at that point.
So
And you need to know why.
how is the alien zoo hypothesis falsifiable? Like, what kind of test could you formulate to prove that we're not an alien zoo? Is it falsifiable?
That's an interesting question. Well, I mean, I think for me, right, like this current point we are in. I mean, I've said this before. I've not been like a big like person to get out and make really hard predictions about UFOs or any of this for most of my life. I really only started getting concrete about what I thought was going on in the last few years. And I'm very much like feeling like, if you find yourself in like 2028, okay, like 4 or 5 years from now, and there hasn't been disclosure about this at a basic level, and we're not looking at some kind of like significant AI phase shift in our technology and our ability as a species, then I completely like just blow all of my probabilities away. And like, I don't even think that 2028 is that far. I mean, I basically have said on the record on Twitter, like, if we don't get some kind of like extraterrestrial oriented confirmation, whether it's like contact or the government tells us or whatever, in the next like 3 years, I'm perfectly willing to run away and say, okay, yeah, we're by ourselves. Like there's nobody else around. Like, like we're totally cool. This is great. I mean, I'm excited if that's true, but like, it really feels to me like a lot of these things, like the zoo hypothesis, all this stuff, the next couple of years, it all is going to just fall out. And
Well, would you be excited if that was true? Because you did say that one of your reasons for having low probability of AI doom is that aliens would prevent it in one way or another.
Oh, I would increase my odds that we're going to hurt ourselves. Okay. But I think they're connected, right? I think what I want, okay, is what I want. I want us to be alone, and I want us to be able to navigate the AI problem without FOOM. Okay. I think that that's like my best case scenario. I think like a scenario I don't want is we aren't alone. Okay. Because I think, particularly on the other side of this cover up, okay, if we didn't have this cover up and all this other stuff, I would be neutral on like if it's good news or bad news if it turns out we're not alone. But like if we aren't alone, I feel really damn strongly that it's bad news. So like right out of the gate, I just like don't want us to not be alone, like personally. Now, if we're not alone, then yeah, that solves our FOOM problem, but it creates our zoo problem, right?
Yeah.
So I'm kind of like how I come down on it. Now, what I think actually is the case is I think the FOOM problem is not really a real problem, just regardless of aliens in general, because it's problematic for other reasons. But I think it's particularly not a problem because I don't think we're alone. I do think we're probably under some kind of like planned either bounding, or hopefully if things go the right way, maybe it is the kind of thing that some people are hoping for, where we've unlocked the door and the key in the door, and now we have graduated to being a serious species, and everyone comes and says hello to us and like is like, yo, what's up, like welcome to the club. I think that is just such an optimistic view, and I'm
Or the Galactic Federation.
I mean, look, like when mankind like kind of zapped into sentience, like we found ourselves in the state of nature. Okay, the fucking world was really harsh. It didn't give a fuck about us. Like it didn't care. Okay, like if we turn out that we're not somehow out against all odds, grabby aliens is wrong, and the Fermi paradox is legit, and or not legit, and we're basically like sitting inside of a larger scale state of nature. I mean, the odds that this is like a good scenario for us, I mean, I just I agree with David Deutsch, okay, in the sense that like I do think that there's a cross-cutting thread of personhood that we would share with any intelligent extraterrestrial life, okay? I think they would recognize us as people in a certain sense, okay? I think there is something about that threshold. But that's not like enough for me to get over the line, particularly like in light of the cover-up, that the cover-up basically is my confirmation, again, if it's all true, okay, if it's true enough that we have to like think we're not alone, it's confirmation that we're living in a state of nature situation. Okay, for me, it's like we're not living in some galactic Star Trek Federation thing. If the government couldn't tell us about the Federation for like 80 years, then probably we're in more of a state of nature situation where like it's bad news. Like it's like something is like we're not in a good situation. I hope I'm wrong. I mean, I really do. Like, I'm trying to think of like what's the steel man of like that we're gonna get this like graduation ceremony. I mean, AI takeoff is really special. I mean, or AI breakthrough is really special. Like getting to the point where you can confer risk to other people in the universe is a significant event. Is it an event where you've proven yourself as a competent, morally, worthy species? I don't know. I mean, if we knew that there was some planet that just managed to cobble together some neural networks, and like we were kind of like, hosting their protection for them, if they pulled off something like this, like would we go on to celebrate them and bring them into the fold? I don't think so. I think we would like basically just be like, yo, you guys can't do that. Sorry. Keep going and living your little life on your weird planet of octopuses or whatever. But like, you guys weren't first. We were. So we're keeping you guys where you're at and enjoy. You guys can have fun. We're not going to let you guys blow up or anything. But like, you know, maybe they'll pluck the smartest humans out or something and let them go live with them or something. But I just don't think it's going to be the kind of thing where we graduate. I don't know. Maybe.
So
Sure.
you posted a lot, especially in the lead up to the Apple Vision Pro announcement, which I'm excited about still, about augmented reality and virtual reality. You even changed your profile picture from the little dude with the full face
Yeah.
covered VR headset to the little dude with the eyes out in the VR headset, the pass through.
Yeah.
So far, with what we have in 2023 VR, which headset do you think is coolest? We got Apple, Quest 3, Quest Pro, big screen beyond whatever Valve has cooking. So what's your favorite right now and why?
Well, I mean, I think right now, I mean, it's kind of a cliche, but I think Apple's basically setting the standard for everybody in terms of like the frontier. I think big screen beyond looks amazing. I haven't used it, but I think that that's going to be a significant win because, I mean, one thing that has been, I think, lost since the very first Oculus Rift was, there's really this really important need to make these things really comfortable to wear and really, really light, right? I mean, the head weight is such a huge variable. And I think, yeah, no, I'm optimistic about those two. I think, right now, I mean, I think I'll just tell you, like, so what I'm working on is still kind of in the XR realm. One of the things that is basically like, I can't go into too much detail, but basically, I think one of the things I've come to kind of believe is that this whole idea of like spatial computing and XR stuff is obviously kind of well on its way to becoming like the primary paradigm for computing, or at least sitting alongside the other ones as a peer. And so I think that being the case, you do kind of run into a little bit of a catch-22 where the current form factors and paradigms for this, where you're basically doing full photonic override in front of the person's eyes on their head, is like definitely not a solution that will cover every human at all times to to participate in this paradigm. And so I think there's basically going to be room for like additional device categories that allow participation in various ways in this like spatial computing paradigm. And so I'm kind of currently working on like new concepts and like ways you can give people access to this stuff that is like not necessarily a thing they would wear on their head. And so I think a lot of the stuff going on with the Vision Pro is like pulling like headsets in one direction. Like Big Screen Bergon is like trying to push like what can we get to be the most comfortable thing you can wear all day for great VR. And so I think like there's this kind of orthogonal vector where it's like, what can you do that's like not going to require the person to wear something on their face to participate, even if they have that, where there's going to be modalities of using this kind of medium that don't necessarily require that. And so that's kind of what I've been exploring recently as kind of like the go left when everyone else is going right type of thing.
What do you think is the kind of minimum viable product that people would actually wear like all day? Because, you know, wearing glasses like this, I
Yeah.
barely even notice that I have them on most of the time, except for when I'm working out. And
Yeah.
I never even notice them. So what would it
Well,
take for people to wear VR?
well, I think it depends on the value proposition, right? I mean, these things are all kind of interconnected, right? If you there's a certain baseline where you have to have it so that you feel, like you said, like comfortable wearing it. And I think that's part of the reason I've been like, feeling like people haven't really been focused on that for a while. It's been like, a minimally minimal, less of a priority. But I think form factor wise, I mean, I don't know. I'm sure Apple has a generation or two out where they kind of are going to take a shot on goal at that. I mean, I thought that you could kind of leapfrog that a bit by making a flip up AR pass through headset. I going into it, I thought that was what Apple was going to try to pull out of their hat for getting us there sooner. I figured they would have some crazy industrial designers trying to crack some kind of slide up or flip up pass through device that was super, super light, but would basically fail through to being transparent in a certain sense because you could flip it up. Whereas the current one, the problem is that like as soon as it runs out of juice, you can't see anything. And so if you want to get there sooner, you need something that's going to fail through to transparent. And I think, if I had to speculate, I think the fail through the transparent approach they're probably taking is going to be a more kind of fancy display oriented one, but that's just me speculating. I think fail through to transparency is the key thing that gets you what I call like all day wear, not all day use, right? You want to get to a point where like a lot of people think, okay, well, if you're wearing a headset, it's on and you're using it all the time. I think the first frontier of like a real all day pass through AR headset is going to be the one that when it runs out of juice, you still want to wear it. At least want to wear it enough that you'll tolerate wearing it so that you can have it accessible in your life habitually all day long. And so I thought Apple's play was going to be more like the Apple Watch style paradigm, where it would be like, not really actively in use most of the time. And it would like elegantly be off, like a watch, like the watch when it's like face is off. I thought that's where they were going to go. I think probably what it boiled down to is they probably just decided it was not the right trade-off to just start with like a dev kit style thing, and then push on the transparent OLED fall through later. But that's just.
I really wish I could talk and comment more about it, but I just haven't even seen an Apple Vision Pro, let alone use one, and I won't for the next 6 months. So I guess from now to then, it's just speculation. But what other features, aside from being fashionable when turned off, what other hardware and software do you think it would be necessary to get universal adoption to the point where people are replacing their phones and maybe even replacing their computers?
Well, I mean, I've had a few thoughts about what way to think about this. So I think there's, it's hard to know for sure. I think one thing that is under, and I mean, I was surprised. Maybe they're going to do this, but I was surprised at how this wasn't really emphasized in Apple's launch. Perhaps because it's not an all-day wear type of device, but excuse me. So I had I had some hearing issues a while back, and AirPods, basically, if you have them in, you can turn up the volume and so on, right? So you can hear better. And I think there's going to be some kind of like very, very simple things that you can do for people if they have an all-day pass-through AR headset that will like generally just make visual perception more enjoyable. And it's kind of ironic talking about this. I actually just recently got glasses, and I was surprised to see how much of a life improvement it was,
Oh yeah.
because my vision wasn't exactly like amazing. It was okay, but it wasn't great. Um, and I think there's an analogy there though, where if you have a pass-through AR headset on, that first of all, it will correct for farsightedness, it turns out. But beyond that, certainly like you can just add some light image-based processing that will increase the fidelity, the contrast, highlight things, maybe do some spectral sliding around the hue, and just kind of making it more enjoyable to look at stuff. I think that's kind of the thing that like I expect to be a decent needle mover for getting people to wear these things all day, because just like when you take your glasses off, like the world kind of starts to suck a little bit if you can't see. I think there might be a chance that the level of enhancement you can afford through these kind of pass-through things will have a similar kind of dilutive effect on when you take it off. It kind of feels not as good to
The
look
best
at.
analogy that I've seen for that is eventually we'll get to a point with AR and VR so that when you take it off, it will be like going to the bathroom without your phone. So
Yeah, I mean,
before phones, I mean, I'm like young, so I don't really know. But like before phones, I guess people just kind of took for granted um, just going to the bathroom, and now you can't do anything without phones. And I bet that VR will have the same kind of effects on people.
yeah, I mean, I think the big thing that's challenging is just like depending on if you can really get the value prop high enough, and if you can get the weight low enough that like you're gonna feel okay having it around all day. But I think it'll get there. Um, I had a pretty different conception. I mean, I had some of I wrote this like long prediction thread for Apple's thing. I mean, I got some of the like things right. I think probably I did better than on average. Just I've been following this for a while, but they really kind of like didn't really go for it on the first version, and to the degree I thought they were going to go for it in terms of like having something that theoretically could hit consumer escape velocity. I mean, they obviously went for it on a million other things, so this isn't like kind of underplaying what they achieved. But I thought they were going to like put something out that was in a position to go vertical if it turned out they had product market fit, even if they thought they didn't, right? But they really didn't put something out that I think it has a ceiling right now on how far it can really go, given like what it is. Just because it doesn't have all day wear and all day wear, not all day use. I think that's like once you unlock that, now at least you have the potential to get to mass adoption all day wear. But without that, you've kind of just like guaranteed you won't. But that's okay. I mean, they'll figure it out.
So what kind of software would you want to see on like a phone replacing VR headset? I mean, personally, I would want to see something like Jarvis from Iron Man, where you're just like,
Yeah.
I mean, that would be awesome. Like Jarvis, call my friends. Jarvis, schedule a meeting for this time, this date. I mean, it's kind of like what people pictured with Siri, but actually like usable, functional, just totally built into your cognition almost.
Yeah, well, I think there's I think there's a couple. I mean, people have thought about a lot of different things. I mean, the kind of contrarian things. I mean, I could talk about the things everyone thinks of, but like the contrarian stuff that I think is interesting are actually, because a lot of people think, oh yeah, adding stuff right is like going to be really cool, and it will be. But I think there's also like a big opportunity to take stuff away. Um, so if you think like an analogy is like when you're playing like first person shooters, right? Like you'll often like dial the graphics quality down so you can like focus on the essentials of what's going on. You can see the rocket, you can see the other player, you can see the walls. You don't really get distracted by the texture maps. I think that we don't have that knob in life to turn things down, and pass through AR will allow us to turn it in both directions. So certainly, like when I'm having a conversation with someone, it would be great if it could not just like tune out the noise audio wise, but also kind of like make us feel like we're in a more intimate environment than we actually are. Or if I'm looking at like a room like I would love to be able to kind of just like dial down various elements to make me kind of feel more at ease. Like I have two young kids, right? They're making a mess all the time, and like there's always stuff strewn everywhere. I certainly wouldn't mind if my AR headset removed the things from my field of view that it knew posed no danger to me to remove. Like, you know, my kid spilled something on, dumped down all of his Legos on the coffee table. Sure, I'm not near the coffee table. Just get rid of those. So like while I'm looking over there, I don't see them, right? I mean, that's just like a rough example, but there's just all these degrees of freedom to kind of dial down visual noise that I think is going to be a big, big value add of these things once they get AR in them. And the other one is social presence. So that's the other, that's the one you can't really do until you have the mass adoption. So like you have the single player game killer app, which I think might be something like that. And then the multiplayer game killer app is going to just be, you know, something I thought would be here probably by now if you asked me a while back. But basically, you know, attention on tap. Like any human on Earth can be with any other human on Earth at any time by clicking a button. Like, you know, Zoom is not that. like that capability is not science fiction. Like we know how you could do it, and that is a transformative capability. So I think that will be the other killer app for this stuff, but it has to go ubiquitous first.
So what do you think are some of the problems inherent to AR? You talked about this a little bit on Twitter. You said there are AI doomers and crypto doomers and doomers for every area of technology so far, except for AR and VR. So I guess the classic example is like men will spawn in like in a VR Ana de Armas girlfriend who's powered by like an LLM and just not interact with people in the real world. And this is already happening with like chatbots on the level of like Bert and like
yeah, I mean the AI trend's happening sooner, and so a lot of people are thinking about these, you know, dystopian scenarios with AR and VR now through the lens of having really sophisticated AIs, and I think those are definitely legitimate for sure risks. I mean, a lot of the stuff I was thinking about, you know, a few years ago with this, I kind of encapsulated in this idea of avatarism, right? Which I still think is going to happen. It's now going to be, you know, really, really intermixed with this AI, you know, curve as well. But I think ultimately what it boils down to is there is going to be kind of like a, you know, epistemological crisis around what, like who has authority over how we are seen. Like if I like when I put these glasses on, right, and I call you on Zoom, like you really like you kind of theoretically could like remove the glasses from my picture, but like you don't really do that. There's not like a readily available thing right now. There's more things like that now than there used to be, but like, you know, in person, you definitely don't have any way to kind of override how I choose to appear to you, right? So the way I call that is I call that freedom of form. It's like when we're meeting in person, I have like the ability to basically choose how I appear to you. Okay. And I just take advantage of the way light bounces off of me. I put stuff on my body so that like I kind of have high confidence I'm going to appear in a certain way to you. So I think like that whole idea of freedom of form is going to be like a major, you know, dialectic kind of discussion. I think it could get quite intense. I haven't really fully updated on it. Like recently, I kind of wrote about it a while ago, but I still think it's a legitimate phenomenon that's going to occur where you're going to have the reason I know this is going to be very like contentious is because it's a good example of the kind of thing where if you put forward like a hypothetical example of like a hypothetical question about it, like specifically, if I'm hanging out with you virtually as an avatar and you're beaming into my living room and you're beaming into my living room, like who gets to decide how I look to you? Like, do I get to decide how I get to look to you? Do you get to decide in what way, and so on? And if you propose this question various ways to people, half the people will say, what a stupid question. Well, they'll all say, what a stupid question. And then half the people will say, that's a stupid question because obviously I get to decide. And then the other half will say, what a stupid question. Obviously you get to decide or whatever, right? And so that to me means, okay, shit, this is going to be actually a really big problem
Yeah.
because that capacity will exist, the agency will exist, and so people are going to fight over who gets to decide in this cases where there's a conflict, and we never really had that before in a kind of large scale way where it's really deeply interleaved in our lives. Like it certainly seems to be the case that like if you have ubiquitous AR and VR, you're going to be in situations where you're hanging out with like five people and you're talking to them and like two of them are physically co-present with you and the other two are not, but you have no way to actually, you don't actually know like offhand like who's actually with you or not physically most of the time, or you're not thinking about it. So once you have a situation like that, everyone's basically being like mediated by technology, like their physical appearance, even the people that are with you physically. um like I had this happen like years ago using VR. Like I worked at a VR company, and you know we would do meetings where we were all in VR together simultaneously. And a bunch of us were in one big office, and a few people were remote. And we would be in these meetings, and like I wouldn't know if like this person I was talking to my left was like literally sitting next to me or like on the other side of the country, right?
Really? Was it
Like
that good?
what's that?
Was it that good?
Well, just you can't know, right? I mean, it's just an avatar, right? So it's like you're talking to this avatar, and like your brain isn't really knowing or caring, is that avatar like physically with me or not,
Yeah, I
right?
heard even like bad VR systems can be very disorienting and almost make you forget that you're in reality. Like I did a demo for a school project where I went around and tried on different people's Meta Quest 2s for different projects. And it was like I would put it on, and every once in a while I would almost think to myself, wait, am I like really standing in like a house next to the beach? And then I would think, no, that's ridiculous. This looks nothing like reality. And then I'd take it off and be like, whoa, what?
Oh yeah, yeah. You can totally lose yourself in this stuff. I mean, the specific thing I'm referring to is just whether or not a person you're engaged with as an avatar happens to be with you physically or not. I think in a situation where people are all wearing pass-through AR headsets and humans are being stitched out with avatars and some other humans are being beamed in as avatars, your mind is not going to really know like whether or not a person's with you or not. Most of the time, you're not going to be thinking about that. Like you will think about it, right? I mean, it's not going to just go away. But when you're in the conversation, when you're doing the thing together, when you're working together, you're going to have like less kind of cognitive load spent on like, is this person remote or not remote? And I think everyone's going to be proxied to some degree. And so now you've got this weird thing where this freedom of form question starts to inject itself into like every human to human interaction. So once you have a situation where every human to human interaction is by definition running up against this principle, and then you have a principle where half the people believe it should go one way and half the people think it should go the other way. Now you've got like a recipe for a big problem. So I think that's kind of one big thing I think is a major risk of AR. I think it's still fine, like we're going to figure it out, but it's just one that I think is going to happen and we should be mindful of.
Yeah, I mean, my solution that I would propose to that problem. So let's say you are hologramming yourself into my living room, and who decides how you appear? I mean, I would say you would decide how you would want to appear, but like the final decision for how you would appear to my headset would be from me. And I mean, I bet in most cases people would not opt to change the way other people appear. Maybe they
Well, I
would.
think,
Would it really make
yeah, I mean,
a difference in some cases? Like if person B doesn't know that their appearance has been changed, then what exactly is the difference? Like if person A wants to like while walking down the street make all like unattractive people attractive or something like that, like how would they be stopped from doing that?
well, I think you're basically walking yourself through the dialectic, right? I mean, I think you're kind of coming at it and you're concluding certain things or how things ought to go. What I'm telling you though is that if you talk to other people, you'll find that they have a similar sense of intuitive truth about how it should go that isn't that, which is surprising. So for example, um, people that do put a lot of stock in how they appear to others, and they put a lot of identity baked into intentionally appearing the way that they do for various reasons, right? I mean, we don't have to get into like various ways this manifests today, but there are people who really do care that they're seen how they want to be seen, and they would take it as a deeply offensive and a personal offense at a minimum, right? So that's kind of more of a social norm. So that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be a like legal catastrophe if it's just a social norm. But there are also people that probably eventually, especially when you integrate the fact that these different avatars and things are going to end up being like essential ways we see each other, that there are going to be people that would consider it kind of like a civil rights type of situation if they find out that you were effectively I mean, think about it like this, right? Here's a thought exercise for you. Let's say that there was a AR filter that you used in your headset that just basically rendered the person naked, right? Like, let's just say that that was a thing somebody made. Now, you can run down the idea maze of like, okay, well, how does that work? Who would make it? Who would run it? What would be the thing that you would have options for? And you can kind of pop out the other side and you're like, okay, well, at the end of the day, some people are going to be really angry that this is being used on them. And the question is like, where does the limit of their ability to limit others from using it run down, right?
Well, I would say there's not a clear distinction there between an AR filter and like imagination. Like I could walk around the street and imagine everyone naked, and people might consider that disrespectful, but like there's nothing that can really be done about that. There's no like actual definable harm being done to people. Maybe
Well, I mean,
I agree with you that these will become more serious in the future.
so just to be clear, right? I'm not like crafting any particular views on this personally. Like I've kind of tried to not front run this because I think it's something I need to think about myself. But I do think that like it's not obvious to me that everyone's going to agree with that. Like I think there's going to be people that will actually want to ban those kinds of things. There's going to be people that would say, well, if you want to use your Apple headset, the Apple people have centralized control over that. And like if you're running some of these unsanctioned filters on people, we've decided as a company, Apple doesn't endorse that. And so it's either going to be impossible or hard for you to install those things. So it's just another example of like who has agency over this. But in this case, the specific problem is that like people are going to be able to override how other people appear, which is it's very uncharted territory.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, I bet in some of the first implementations, it will just kind of be banned by default for the same reason that getting ChatGPT to write a speech endorsing Hitler is banned by default because they just don't want to deal with it. And it's easier to just ban it and forget about it than it is to allow it.
Yeah, I mean, it gets very, very tricky. I mean, there's a whole bunch of unknown things about what kinds of avatars they're going to be. Like, there's a certain point where you can't outrun culture. So, like, let's say there's dragon avatars and there's elf avatars, and people who are dragon avatars get really pissed if you view them as elf avatars. And now there's a special rule, like if you're elf avataring somebody that was a dragon, like, oh, now you're like an elf, you're a dragonist or something, and you're like, there's just, I mean, this is just like me just spitballing, but there's a certain point where like the culture is going to move a lot faster than the technology companies can, and it's just going to be a giant mess. I mean, it's fine. Like I'm not like it's not very high on my list of concerns, but you asked about like AR risk. That to me is like a significant one that's going to cause a lot of cultural rifts and contention. That's kind of off of everybody's radar right now.
Yeah. So, last topic, how would you trace your intellectual journey over time? How did you come to become interested in VR, in aliens, in AI, and programming?
I don't know. I mean, I kind of had a past. I mean, I've always been a software engineer and I've always worked on, computers and stuff. So I had kind of a past life as an engineer working on search infrastructure and kind of systems and things like this. Um, and then I kind of just went through a transition where I was like, okay, what should I work on? And I tried an Oculus Rift TK1, and I was like, okay, this is obviously insanely cool. I want to work on that. Um, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I kind of started writing more aggressively on Twitter only in the last few years. I've kind of found it to be a really like, productive way to kind of like think out loud. Um, and I don't know, I think it's just a generally good exercise to write if you like, want to think about things. And so I've been using that as a way to kind of increase the breadth of my, mental models and how I kind of come to any conclusions about anything. But I don't know. I mean, I haven't really been talking too much about my current work. I mean, most of my time is spent developing, new XR hardware and software that I hope to be sharing more about soon. So, I mean, I know I tweet a lot, but most of my actual intellectual energy is going into building something really, really cool right now. And so it's kind of more of like a side interest, a lot of these intellectual pursuits, but I enjoy them.
And you also talk about how you read The Beginning of Infinity by David Deutsch, which is a book that a lot of very smart people have cited as like a huge inspiration. Naval, Brett Hall created a whole podcast called
Yeah.
TLK Cast Theory of Knowledge. Highly recommend. Love that podcast about it. And you said something along the lines of, in reference to EAC, like we don't need EAC because there already is like there's a better techno-optimist philosophy out there, and this is it. So like when did you first discover Beginning of Infinity, and like how did it change your worldview?
I mean, I read it a long time ago, and I really had no idea that it was something that other people really got a lot out of until, I mean, it feels relatively recently. I mean, I didn't really know Naval had really read a lot in like taken a lot from it and all of that. I read it, and it was one of these books that it just left an imprint on me. And like a lot of it wasn't even obvious at the time. Like it's only obvious in retrospect how much it was informing how I thought about things. Um, I don't know. There's just a certain level of kind of um, what's the right word? There's a certain intellectual consistency to it, and an intellectual honesty to it, and it kind of closes a lot of just poor reasoning and really really bad philosophy I've read over the years of like how to think about things. And maybe there's selection bias. Being a technologist, being a techno optimist, kind of innately by default, it kind of was like primed for somebody like me to latch onto it and kind of adopt some of its principles and how I think about things. But I don't know. I mean, I read it a long time ago. I've read it one or two more times since then, and it just kind of naturally was my favorite book ever. And
Yeah.
I've with people, and then I found out many years after that that I wasn't alone in that. I didn't even know anybody even knew about it. In fact, I don't even know how I found that book originally. It was just such a good book that I read it, and it just immediately became like my favorite book on anything close to philosophy or things like this. So yeah, I mean, it's basically that simple. I mean, I think over time, having now kind of more, directly engaged with people who have thought about it, I have found that there are some elements to, things that I've kind of carved out my own interpretation of some of this stuff, which is, I think, a good sign of a healthy philosophy where there's slight nuance and like internal discussions about it, but it's all like really productive and really, really good. And I think one thing, I mean, I don't know how many people are going to watch this, but basically, I kind of thought of this the other day in light of the EAC stuff. And I actually worked with Balaji Srinivasan a while back in helping him with his the network state book.
Oh,
And actually really like it made me think of recently, like that work made me think that the beginning of Infinity does deserve a kind of first class uh, you know, public introduction for everyone in this moment. I think it actually really is time for everyone to have read this book. So the way I like my pitch to David Deutsch, if he's out there, is that I really think that that book deserves to be brought in, made open into the public domain. And I think that it deserves to be publicly available on the internet for anyone to read around the world in any language at any time. Um, and so maybe it could be a second edition. Maybe he would do some revisions or something. I mean, I'm not asking or anything, but I think like, it just really feels like the time is right for that philosophical work to be put forward and basically packaged up for the world at large to really genuinely engage with in a way that I think it really has been kind of like isolated to a small sect of people. But now that these technology curves are really forcing us to reckon with a lot of important things around how do we actually create knowledge? How do we think of ourselves as humans or as people? Are we special or are we not? Um, I think now is the time for this philosophy to be well understood and part of the kind of global zeitgeist. And I really hope that, if there's any way I can help, I'd be happy to.
I mean, you
And
can ping him on Twitter. He's like constantly active on Twitter. I've pinged him before, and he's actually responded to me a couple of times.
yeah,
So maybe that's something that he would be open to. And
yeah, I've been
I
thinking
did
about like
tweet.
what it might look like to kind of just put it together into something. But it just kind of struck me even just the other day that like it feels like a real V2 type of thing where it's not necessarily a rewrite of the book or anything, but a kind of repackaging and launch like we kind of did with the network state would be really kind of cool.
Yeah, I did tweet once about like, what if somebody created a website like Less Wrong, but instead of being based around Eliezer Yudkowsky and the sequences, it was based around David Deutsch and the beginning of infinity. And I still think that that's a pretty good idea that I might be open to building at some point.
Yeah, certainly there's plenty of conversations that could hang off of the book for sure. Um, I think there's going to be a lot of search for meaning, and there's going to be a lot of search for purpose, and there's going to be a lot of search for like how to think clearly when and if either it turns out we're able to create things that look and feel like people in computers, or if it turns out that we're not the only people and there are other people already out there that are now starting to actually interact with us. I think both of those things, regardless if it's good news, bad news, having at least some basic foundational understanding of how knowledge is created, what it is to be a person, what we ought to expect from these things, and how to actually know if they're doing what we say they're doing. I think all of that is like essential tools of literacy now going forward as we start to run up against some of these big questions and realities. So,
Yeah. Well, with that, I think that's a pretty good place to wrap it up. So thank you so much, Greg Fodor, for being the first guest ever on my podcast.
pleasure.
I had a great talk. Stay optimistic, and we'll see you in the next episode.
Thanks for listening to this episode with Greg Fodor. If you like this episode, be sure to subscribe to the Theo Jaffe podcast on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Follow me on Twitter at Theo Jaffe, and subscribe to my Substack at theojaffe.com. Thank you again, and I'll see you in the next episode.